A friend of mine told me a story about one night at their grandparents' place. She lives out in the country where the nearest house is about a half a mile away. But it's always a family member who lives nearby, so there were never any worries about kids being kidnapped or anything bad like that. It was during the summer and they had a family get-together. The kids were left home alone while the parents helped out a ceremony not too far from where they were staying at. Like I said, you never have to worry about anything happening because everyone knew everyone, and the kids were pretty mature to take care of themselves. One rule the grandmother always had was never to play outside after dark. If you had to go out, there had to be 2 persons and they should always stay near the house. The houses on our rest didn't have running water or electricity at the time, so whenever you needed to use the bathroom, you had to go to the outhouse, which was pretty far and people always had flashlights for these reasons. This evening the kids decided they wanted to play tag in the dark, but they used the flashlights to tag the other person. They went out and started to play. There were at least 7 to 10 kids ages 7 to 13 playing, and 2 of them shared one flashlight. The only person who had their own was the person who was tagging. They played a few rounds and then it started to get really late and dark. Some of the kids said they wanted to go home, but the younger girl of the group said that she wanted to play one more time because she didn't get to hold a flashlight or play the tagger. They all agreed, and they also said that because she's being a crybaby, they were going to make the last game difficult for her, to which she would find a great challenge and fun as well. They began to hide here and there, behind cedar trees and old trucks or down ditches. Some of them went as far as to climb into trees and hide, because they thought it would be fun to jump out and scare the little ones. My friend then said that he could hear his cousin counting to 10, and then called out, "Ready or not, here I come." He was one of them who hid in the trees, so he could see her light flashing as she went out searching. At some point, he lost track of her light, and he began to get tired. It was taking too long for her to find them, so he just climbed down and started walking back to his grandmother's house. When he got back, he saw his other cousins as well, and they all said that they thought she came back too. Then one of them said that they heard a girl crying, and the crying was leading back to the house, so they thought it was the little girl crying because she couldn't find anyone. They noticed everyone was home, except for the little girl, so they went out looking for her. A group of kids were told to run to the ceremony grounds and bring back the adults to help them search for her. The search began to get tense as they tried to follow the footsteps, but it was hard to distinguish because there were so many from them playing around. When the adults came back, they began driving around and shining their headlights at high beam. They drove quite a distance when they noticed the yellow flashlight on the ground next to a shoe. They went to check on it and looked around, and that's when they noticed the body on one of the tree limbs. They found the girl, but she was all scratched and bruised. Her hair was a mess with pieces of bark and juniper in it. She had dry tears on her face as well. They woke her up, and she looked very confused. She didn't cry. She just looked up and went back to sleep. They took her to the hospital and waited for her to recover. The adults thought that maybe one of the wild dogs attacked her, but she didn't have any bite marks. Then they thought that maybe she did it to herself, but it was obvious that some areas of her body had bruise marks that were fingertip larger than hers. When she recovered fully, they questioned her. She said that when she went out to find them, there was a light leading further from where they were playing. She ended up following it, thinking it was her cousins. That's when she saw a little girl behind a tree and thought that maybe it was one of her cousins, so she went to catch her. When she got closer, she noticed that the girl was not dressed in normal clothes. She had on animal fur, from what she said, and she wasn't speaking English or Navajo. It was grunts and whistle noises. Then she said it grabbed her hard and pushed her. By then she was scared, so she said she tried to tell it to stop, but it kept grabbing her and pushing her. That's when she ran. She ran and found one of the trees her cousins usually climb. She knew it was well, so she climbed as high as she could. She said that this thing was below her, and it was just grunting and whistling at her the whole time. After a while, She closed her eyes and said she heard it go quiet, and that's when she fell asleep. The parents ended up having a ceremony. The medicine man said it was one of the Anasazi girls that she had encountered, which could actually be true because there was a small settlement found nearby in the canyons where they lived. All that existed there was a stone wall and some broken pottery. Such places are forbidden and should never be disturbed. Even after all this, the medicine man told everybody to not talk about this situation and to forget that it even happened. This was told to me back in 5th grade, so I don't know if it's true, but I know for sure I will never play in the dark. Not at 7 or 70 years old. Don't go out in the res at night. I've never been a big fan of camping. For some reason or another, my friend and I decided to take a Saturday night to camp on private property. We had permission from the owner on the bank of a small lake in the American Southeast. The lake wasn't very big. It was about 50 to 150 yards across. I'm not great at estimating distance, by the way. It was more of a deep pond, but it was about 5 times as long as it was wide. And from the perspective of our camp, it consumed the majority of our sight line. The plot of land itself wasn't entirely removed from civilization. We were about 5 to 10 miles outside of a small suburb of a mid-sized southern city. It definitely was not easy to access. However, the road was gated and locked. The owner gave us his code. We pulled the car through and locked the gate behind us. If you've ever been down south, you'll know how quickly it gets isolated outside of cities. Our cities are small and the people around often live rough and wild. We have some dense woods that are so thick that they're not even worth building in, unless you have some connection or attachment to the area. I heard it was not profitable to cut roads through it, back when they were building highways in the 50s. So there hasn't been much development that has happened in the last 100 years, and in some places, basically since the Civil War. It's not uncommon to go for a 30-minute drive straight out of town and come upon cabins that are obviously off the grid. My friend and I were used to living in the suburbs, so we were just happy to see stars and hear the sounds of nature. We were at our small camp, simply looking around and enjoying the night when suddenly, my buddy sat up real straight. He said something like, "Do you see that guy over there?" He pointed to the other side of the small lake. I didn't see anything. I sat up slightly and said, "It's most likely just the darkness playing tricks on you." But he actually seemed shaken and said, "No, look, there's a bunch of faces behind the trees now." This got my attention as I sat up fully, rubbing my eyes to try to gain full focus. And then I saw them, small, round, white faces staring back at me from across the lake. Maybe about 15 or 20 of them. All of them were positioned in such a way that their bodies were behind the trees, and only their heads were visible. The best way I can describe the faces are like very pale, somehow internally illuminated children. I should mention that neither of us were drinking or getting high. We were too young for that. Not for at least a few more years. We had already ate dinner at home, and we were just planning on going to sleep after chilling outside for a while. The faces weren't moving. I was kind of sitting there in shock, thinking that my eyes would adjust eventually, and that I would see that they were just a reflection of bugs or owls or something. But that would never happen. I stared right back at them for what felt like 5 minutes, looked back at my friend, and then they were gone. All of them. My buddy started to tear up a little bit when he said, "What the fuck were those?" And I didn't have a good answer. None of us slept peacefully well that night. This experience definitely made me dislike camping. I tried to do some research on the internet, but I never found anything that could explain what we saw. Thanks for listening. I'm not sure if you're familiar with native culture, but there are subjects and topics that we don't even talk with outsiders. Why? Well, because it's forbidden. For example, before I tell the story that I'm about to share with you, I had to get permission by my mom. We as natives must get permission to tell these type of stories. Why do you think there are so many lands and reservations that are off limits to outsiders? Another example that I can think of is how in the Catholic Church, some things have to be approved all the way from the Vatican or by your local bishop, especially, for example, an exorcism. Well, it's the same thing with our stories. They're sacred. Some stories even have to be approved by our local elders, even to tell other natives within our community, especially if it involves family matters. My grandmother shared a story with us over 30 years ago. I remember most of it, but my mother helped me out a bit as I wrote it. I had to write it down on paper first, as it made it easier to remember many of the details, and to get her approval to share with you all. Whether you believe it or not, it doesn't really matter. What does matter is on how you perceive this, because in the end, the stories will live on. So my grandmother was a South Texas native woman who came from a long line of curaderas, the medicine women of the peyote people of Oaxaca, Mexico, but now South Texas. She grew up on the Rio Grande Valley in an area filled with many stories and folklore. She once told us a story about a local legend that's been around for many generations. Many years ago, when she was very young, she was out in the monte, in the woods, collecting herbs and harvesting peyote with her aunt. It was a warm South Texas summer evening that seemed to be a little bit different, somehow, as my grandmother said. She and her aunt strayed off a bit too far into the woods and it started to get too dark. When they turned back to head towards home, they noticed they got too quiet. The crickets stopped chirping, and the nighthawk birds seemed to get spooked and fly off into different directions. Her aunt started to get very nervous, and she grabbed my grandmother's hand and told her to follow her lead down the path. My grandmother noticed her aunt grabbing some dried Texas sage out from a bag, and she started to crush it in her hands. She said a prayer, and then she threw the sage in all directions. Finally, my grandmother asked what was wrong. Her aunt told her La Lechuza, the owl witch, was nearby. She said her eyes were upon them. Then, that's when they both heard a horrible sound, coming from behind. She looked at my grandmother and told her not to look at any large glowing eyes, just to focus on the path back to the ranch house. The screeching sound was getting closer as they both started to walk faster. Her aunt kept saying some silent prayers while they walked fast on the path. My grandmother felt a strange cold wind hit her from behind. Being young and scared and curious, she turned her head back to see what was behind her. She said that she saw a big shadow figure standing behind them on the same path that they were on. That's when she saw the hideous looking face and large glowing eyes. Then, she said that she felt a chill and heard a strange whispering voice in her head, but she couldn't understand the language. Her aunt turned and scolded at my grandmother and turned her head towards the path. She reminded her not to look at it. Then, they both heard one final screeching sound, fading into the distance. When they finally reached the ranch house, my grandmother started to feel sick. Her mother, who is my great-grandmother Severa, asked what happened. My great-grandmother's sister Teresa told her that they were being chased by La Lechuza. My great-grandmother quickly got startled and scared. She knew that my grandmother had some kind of curse put upon her. Quickly, my great-grandmother Severa and her sister put my sick grandmother on the bed. My grandmother told me that she was getting very cold chills and a very high fever. She kept hearing that strange whispering in her head over and over. Her aunt gave her a bad tasting tea made from different herbs and peyote. It made my grandmother fall asleep within 15 minutes after drinking it. While my grandmother slept, My great-grandmother Severa and her sister started to pray over my grandmother, and they healed her with a fresh chicken egg. They rubbed the egg lightly all over her body while praying. When my grandmother woke up the next morning, she felt relaxed and calm. My great-grandmother Severa came into the room and sat down next to my grandmother and told her the entire story about La Lechuza, the owl witch. In her sleep, she was having strange nightmares. She said in these nightmares, this creature, the owl witch, La Lechuza, was chasing her, making all sorts of screeching sounds. She said she was just running through some woods that never ended, always feeling cold, with the screeches right behind her, making my grandmother's skin crawl. She also said that these voices that were coming from it were in some other sort of language that she didn't understand. She said she felt like this witch was casting a spell with every word, binding her down and just filling her mind and eyes with fear and confusion. She was cured of the curse, but the moment will never be forgotten. She continues to hear this voice sometimes, reminding her of the event. My grandmother told me the story when I was about 12 years old. She told us this story not to scare us, but to warn us to be cautious when we're alone in the deep woods. There are forces out in this world that people simply ignore. I heard many stories and other encounters of similar experiences. The belief of La Lechuza is real for our people. I myself have never seen La Lechuza when out in the woods of the South Texas River Valley, but I have felt a strange and sinister presence around me before. Could it have been La Lechuza? I'm not sure, but sometimes we have to open up our perception because there's a reason why these stories are told through every generation. Now, before I finish, there's something I must say, especially to those who are not familiar or thinking that this isn't real. You see, in our culture, there's a belief that's deeply ingrained within us. It's about the consequences of speaking of our sacred stories without the proper reverence or permission. The elders around us teach us that when we share these stories without the blessing of those who safeguard our tradition, we run the risk of inviting negative things into our lives. It's not just a matter of disrespecting our ancestors or watering down our cultural legacy. Every word has power. They carry the weight of beliefs and experiences. When shared recklessly, they can attract unwelcome attention from the unseen, who may take notice, being drawn by the words that you speak. So as you finish listening to this, please remember the wisdom of our ancestors. Respect the boundaries set by our elders, for in doing so, you not only honor our traditions but also safeguard your own self from the things around us. Believe it or not, when I told her I was going to share this, she said she was going to get counsel from one of the elders, and out of everything, the only emphasis was placed on giving this story to you all as a warning to be careful of what you dig into. Sometimes finding the truth can reveal things that are far more sinister than you ever imagined. Thanks for listening. This is said to have happened a long time ago, maybe back in the 20s or 30s. This story is about a Navajo man who was working as a ranch hand for a rich Navajo who had a lot of horses and cattle and sheep all around the western part of the Navajo Res in Tuba City, Arizona. One day, he decided to go home to see what his relatives were doing, somewhere past Shiprock, New Mexico. So he talked to his supervisor and asked to take leave, and he was going to go home to see his family. So he packed a good horse and started off his long journey home early in the morning, cross country through canyons, mesas, and open country. Somewhere along the way he stopped for a rest stop, and while he was resting, he spotted an old mangy coyote sitting on top of a hill not too far away. He took out his rifle, aimed, and fired. The coyote slumped over and didn't move again, so he climbs up to see his kill, and there, laying before him, he couldn't believe his eyes. The dead body was that of a young Navajo man with long hair. His body was half human, and bottom half animal. The upper part of the body was painted with designs, and his lower half was coyote. He had shot a Yenagloshi. It must have been resting like he was when he shot it. He got scared and didn't know what to do with it. He walked around and he saw a deep crevice along the edge, so he dragged its body and threw it down, only hearing its body hit somewhere deep down in the dark crevice. As scared as he was, he decided he needed to distance himself away from it, across Chinle Valley and over the big Chuska Mountains. He rode all day and into the night, pushing his horse to the limit. He was finally able to make it across the Chuska Mountains and past Shiprock to a relative's home, where he told him what happened. They told him to never go back to his employer and to stay there because the relatives of the Skinwalker would sure be looking for answers and be out looking for him. Several months passed, and one day he felt safe enough to come out of hiding, and there was a ceremony happening somewhere around Shiprock. He decided to attend. When he got to the ceremony, there were many people in attendance, camping, and with their wagons parked here and there. And just as he was beginning to enjoy the ceremony, there was an old Navajo man walking around among the people, talking out loud. The old man was saying they were looking for a son who had gone missing a couple of months ago. The old man was telling everybody about his son's journey and where his son had last stopped and where he was last seen. He said he had gone missing after his last known location and never showed up at the next stop. The old man was describing exactly the young Navajo and the area of the rest where he had shot it. Next, the old man says, "And there is one man that knows what happened to our son, and he is here among you today. We are camped over there, and we would like for you to come over to our camp and tell us what you know about what happened to our son." The guy knew the old Navajo man was talking about him, and somehow knew he was in attendance at the ceremony. He said he left the ceremony as quickly and quietly as possible, and he stayed hiding for many years at his home. He said he never went back to work for his employer over on the western part of the Navajo res, and he stayed home. After many years later, he finally came out of hiding, and he told his story to only a few people that he trusted. He said he never went back to the western part of the Navajo res. You may ask, how did the people find out this was the man? Well, when the old man announced his search for his missing son at the ceremony, it wasn't a coincidence. You see, Navajo ceremonies serve as channels through which communication with the spirit world is done. I won't go too much into detail, but there are ceremonies where prayers are offered, tobacco, invoking the assistance of spirits for guidance and clarity. Through this process, secrets, revelations can surface, shedding light on mysteries and revealing the truth that's hidden beneath the surface. There's also the communication with elders, as their experience and connection to the Navajo traditions and medicine provide valuable guidance. You see, they have the knowledge passed down through generations, enabling them to decipher the signs and messages from the spiritual side of things with wisdom and discernment. Let the story be a reminder of digging into things that are beyond our understanding and the weight of the choices we make. Within the Navajo tradition, encountering a skinwalker can possibly bring a curse onto your life. So let this be a reminder to be careful, respect the cultural beliefs, and be mindful of the unseen that exists in the world around us. I was always a solitary kid growing up. I grew up on the outskirts of my little town that I grew up in and never really had any friends. I would hang out with someone here and there, but for the most part, I stuck to myself. Even in high school, I found time to invest in hobbies such as fishing, hunting, and playing cards. I used to always love a game of spades with my parents and little brother. Even though I loved all the hobbies that I did, hunting was my favorite. I would go hunting on all sorts of critters when it was in season, and I would spend hours just to hunt something. You see, the fun part of it wasn't the fact that I just killed something. It was the fact that I had outsmarted the animal. I now had a trophy to signify my victory. Nothing would come close to the feeling that I would get when I came home with a fresh kill under my belt. I would spend days out in the wilderness to hunt, and I would get lost out there with nature, with nothing but the sounds of the other creatures that filled the woods in which I was choosing to steal life away from. Due to my love for hunting and fishing, I never found time to do schoolwork. I passed all my classes with at least a C, and I graduated high school, but further education was not something destined for me. I was convinced hunting was my calling. After high school, I began to go hunting, not just for pleasure, but for work as well. There was a company close by to my hometown that made deer jerky and was looking for hunters that could get the meat. Of course, me, the self-proclaimed lover of such activities, applied for this position, and after a week of waiting, I got the job. I was to begin as of right then and there, so I grabbed my gear and went out to the woods and set up shop in the tree stand, the same tree stand that I had been using for as long as I can remember, and I began to wait. I must have sat in that stand for hours, because soon the sun was beginning to set. It was summer though, so I knew I had some time before I was shrouded in darkness. And that's when I saw him. There was a male buck. It got into view all the way on the horizon. I sat there watching it, mesmerized by how it was moving. It calmly paced the forest floor, bending over here and there to eat some grass or berries, until finally it came to the creek that I had set my stand up near to. It stood for a moment. It looked around and dropped its head to take a much needed sip of water. This was it, the moment that I had been waiting for. I raised my rifle, knowing I had only one shot, and I aimed at it directly behind its front shoulder. I took a deep breath. My shot was perfect. It traveled directly through the buck's heart, and it killed him on the spot. My heart swelled as again I knew I won. All this waiting was not in vain. I nearly flew down the steps to my stand and rushed over to the buck. His eyes were still open. I was glad it was instant though, so that he wouldn't have to suffer. I picked him up and soon I was back home. I called the company and soon they had someone come over to my house and pick up the latest kill. I thanked the man as he left and shut my door, feeling more proud than ever. I knew that this is what I was going to do for the rest of my life, or so I thought. A few years passed and I continued doing what I loved, and eventually I received enough money from hunting that I moved away from my hometown and moved to West Virginia, as I heard that the hunting there was great. I wanted to live out in the backcountry, as I wanted to go hunting all the time, and I found a place where I could do just that. There was an old cabin, not too expensive, and it sat right there in the forest, not too far away from a town, maybe a 15 or 20 minute drive, so not completely isolated. I liked it, and I made a couple of friends in town as well. Most of them like hunting, but only one ever wanted to come with me to go. His name is Brian. Brian's a good guy, so we got along well, and we gone hunting a few times. The only difference between us is that he's got a full family, wife, the kids, even has a golden retriever. He's a lucky guy, I'll tell you that. He's a good shot too, and I'm glad he's my hunting partner. I had set up my tree stand maybe a week after buying the cabin out in the forest, and maybe a month after that is when Brian and I first went hunting together. We sat up in that stand for hours, waiting for something to turn up. Eventually, a doe did show up, and we did our thing and carried her back to my cabin. At this point, I had already learned enough about the making of jerky to know how to do it myself, and with the help of Brian, we skinned the dough, and we began making jerky and steaks. We would go hunting maybe once or twice every 2 weeks, but I would go hunting almost every night. At this point, I had found another company somewhat close by, maybe an hour away, that again needed hunters to gather meat. So once again I applied and got the job. Everything seemed to be going well. I was good at my job and it also paid well. Almost every night, I was always up in the tree stand for so long, so I knew just about every sound in the woods, from the elk to mountain lion screams, all the way to foxes and coyotes. You give me a noise out in the woods and I could tell you exactly what animal it is, and sometimes even tell you the gender of it. That's what made this night so different. Like always, I was up in my stand, and that's when I heard it, a scream. I played it off like it was nothing, because it was most likely nothing. Except this time, the scream was different. It sounded similar to something I heard before, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Brian was with me and he also couldn't figure it out. Most of the time we don't really care about these noises, as it's not exactly our business to worry about every little sound we hear in the woods at night. However, this noise was just wrong. Something was not right with this scream. Something was not right about it. And after a good 10 minutes of sitting through it and thinking through every animal it could be, Brian and I decided that we would go check it out. After all, we were both armed and had good shots, and if it was a mountain lion, we figured it would run away as soon as it heard us coming. We got down from the stand and began our walk towards the direction of the scream. After a minute or two, we could tell we were getting closer because the noise was just getting louder. It seemed to echo throughout the trees, and I'm not gonna lie when I say it freaked us both out a little bit. However, we continued on, and after another minute of hiking, we stumbled upon a clearing, where we saw where the noise was coming from. It was a huge elk, standing in the middle of the clearing, just screaming out into the night. We looked at each other, and through the look on Brian's face, I could tell he still shared the same uneasiness that I was feeling. We turned to look at the huge elk, still screaming, and deciding to let it be. We walked all the way back to the stand. After some back and forth, we decided it would be in our best interest to call it a night and just go home. When we hunted at night, Brian usually stayed in the guest room in my cabin, as it was always late when we got done, around 2 or 3 in the morning, and he didn't want to wake up his children or his wife when he got home, so he would crash at my place. However, even though we were far away now from the elk, it seemed like it was following us, because the screams were just as loud as ever. This did kind of freak us both out, but we figured if we went to sleep, it would all be over in the morning. So we did. However, it wasn't the ending. When we woke up, the scream had disappeared. Brian said goodbye, and he left for his home. I did the same routine. I went into town and waited until dusk before going back out into the woods and into my stand. I was still a bit unnerved from last night, but I figured this would help me get my mind off of it, and it did. That was until midnight, when I heard the scream again. This time, however, the scream really sounded wrong. Like, really wrong. I could tell this was not the same scream from last night, but again, I couldn't tell what type of animal it was. I hoped and prayed that it would go away, but it didn't. The screaming continued on and on until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what the hell was screaming in the dead of night. I set out in the same direction as last night, expecting for the worst to be awaiting me. I continued through the underbrush until finally I reached the clearing from the night prior. What I saw this time shook me to my core. There was no elk, like I had expected. Instead, there was a figure standing in the middle of the clearing, facing away from me. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. This thing was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and I couldn't tell if it was human or something else. I'll admit it, I was fucking terrified. I had never seen something like this before, and I was ready to book it away from there. I didn't want whatever this thing was to see me though, so I backpedaled as slow as I could, staring at this thing for as long as it was in view. As soon as it was just on the horizon, it stopped screaming. I froze and thought, why did it stop? I wondered. I stood there in the trees, dumbfounded, staring at this fucking 8-foot tall creature that had just been screaming in the middle of the woods. I realized now what a fatal mistake I had made by not running home as soon as I saw this thing. As I was standing there, it turned around, and my body was struck with fear. Even though I was at least 300 yards away from this thing, I know it was staring directly at me, and it knew that I was there. Its yellow eyes were piercing into my heart. As it got down on all fours and began screaming once again, it started galloping towards me. I stood there frozen for another moment before booking it. I knew all the shortcuts to my house, and I took every single one of them. Knowing that I didn't have much time left, I started sprinting faster than I ever had, hearing its echoing cries in the distance. Its growing intensity only proving I was going too slow. As the sound grew louder than ever, I saw my house. I fumbled with my keys to get to the one that opened my front door, and as I reached the porch, I found it. I unlocked the door and shut it as soon as I got there. The cries, the screaming, whatever the fuck it was screaming right outside. And I knew whatever this thing was, it was at my front door, walking around, searching for what I assume a way to get inside. Terrified, I hid in my freezer, where I hoped the smell of meat and ice would help mask my scent to this thing. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of glass breaking. Then, the sound of footsteps. This thing had found its way inside my house, and I could hear it moving around upstairs, tracking any signs of me, I know. I did try texting Brian to get over to my place, but my messages didn't go through. And given that it's 3 in the morning, I doubt he was gonna see them anyways. After about 30 minutes of not hearing this thing anymore, I got out, freezing, but I feel like my body was ignoring all that, because I was too focused on trying to figure out if this thing had left. I sat there in the basement all night, aiming directly at the door, waiting to see if this thing showed up. It never did. I eventually fell asleep on the floor. The morning came. I woke up, and I noticed that the door to the basement was open. My heart fucking dropped. But I'm still here. So what happened? I'm not sure. But I will tell you what happened the days after. I ended up moving and selling that fucking house. As much as I love the outdoors, ever since that experience, I fucking moved out and never went back to living in the woods again. Everything happened so fast. I told Brian. I know he probably didn't believe me, but I didn't care. I moved out. I moved to a whole other fucking city, and I will never go into some woods again. A few days ago, I packed up my car and made my way to an Airbnb that I actually rented a few miles outside of Andrews, North Carolina. I live and work just north of ATL, and just felt like being in the city was draining what little bit of sanity that I had left. Most of my team, including myself, had switched to working remotely from home due to COVID, and since I live alone, I was starting to feel the mental toll of staring at the same 4 walls of my cramped 1-bedroom apartment, day in and day out. A lot of people were struggling with the transitions to working from home, so the overall production went down, and the workload seemed to be piling up, more than we could keep up with. Project after project, they kept getting dumped into my lap, and since we're all cooped up inside all the time at home, I didn't feel like I could escape the crushing weight of all this added stress. One day, I felt that I had reached my breaking point. I submitted a time-off notice to my supervisor. I booked an Airbnb and decided I would spend a couple of weeks near the national forest. I figured if I was going to be isolated, I could at least use a change of scenery. I had always enjoyed hiking and camping as a kid. In fact, moving to the big city for my job had always felt a little bit out of character for me. I was excited to reconnect with nature and enjoy everything that the park had to offer. I figured that because of all the lockdown restrictions, foot traffic on the hiking trails would be minimal, so I would basically have most of the woods to myself. The weather was supposed to be nice and cool for most of my visit, without being unbearably cold. Perfect for wandering around in the forest, fishing, bird watching, or whatever else I felt like doing. I left around sunrise and arrived at my rental shortly before noon. The cabin was well sized, and it was rustic but appeared to be well maintained. I retrieved the key from the lockbox near the front door, and I made my way inside to get settled. The cabin was quite a bit larger than my one-bedroom apartment in the city, but somehow it felt much more welcoming. I walked into the bedroom and took in the breathtaking view from out of the panoramic window that covered the back wall. Miles of forest for as far as the eye could see, gently fading into shades of green and gray, underneath the trees that only allowed scattered beams of sunlight to peek through. I thought about laying down on the bed with one of the books that I had brought along with me, but I decided against it. Given that the day was still young and I was excited to go exploring, I had gotten rather lucky in finding this cabin rental. Not only was it secluded within the national forest, but one of the features that was on the website was that there was a private hiking trail that started right off to the side of the cabin itself. Several of the reviews that I read before booking said that the trail was scenic and captivating. A few miles in, the private trail would eventually dump out into one of the public hiking routes, but according to the reviews, no one had ever had a stranger come into the private trail and end up near the cabin. I laced up my hiking boots and headed out into the trail. Beautiful trees reaching high into the sky were towering over me, gently tossing in the wind and rustling their leaves. I found myself staring at them as I walked further and further into the forest, barely able to take my eyes off of them to watch where I was going. That's until something, tall and dark, caught my attention deep within the trees off the path. I squinted to try to make out the large object, but I couldn't discern what it was from where I was standing. Against my better judgment, I turned off the trail and started walking towards it. Curiosity had gotten the better of me, and I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep that night unless I quenched my thirst for adventure. As I got closer, I found myself puzzled as I realized what I was looking at. A dark, colored, metal staircase leading to nowhere. I walked around the base of it to see if I could figure out what had become of the rest of the building. To my surprise, there was no evidence of any building ever being connected to this set of stairs. I chuckled to myself about what I just found, reaching for my back pocket to get my phone for some photographic evidence. I quickly realized that in my excitement to get out into the trails, I left my phone behind in the cabin. I figured it wasn't the best idea to be out here without a phone, so I turned back and found my way back into the trail to head back to the cabin. I hadn't realized how much the hike took out of me, so I took a shower and decided to spend the rest of the night just relaxing. The next morning, I woke up feeling energized, but I couldn't get the thought of that bizarre staircase out of the back of my mind. After making myself something to munch on, I laced up my boots once again, double checking to make sure that I had my cell phone this time, and I set out to get some pictures of my recent discovery so that I could convince myself that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. After walking for quite a while, I started to feel defeated, unable to locate where I had found the staircase. As I began toying with the idea of heading back to the cabin to make myself something for lunch, a strange noise caught my attention from up ahead in the trees. I began to walk towards the direction of the sound. And soon enough, what had originally started off as a low humming noise had evolved into the rumbling tones of tribal horns being played in unison throughout the forest. The sound was growing loud. As I continued towards the source, a creeping feeling of dread began to pull in the pit of my stomach. I felt like I had been drawn into a state of hypnosis by the sound of the horns. I snapped back into reality, and there in front of me, the staircase. Somehow, I had made my way back to the foot of the mysterious staircase. At this point, the horns were sounding so loud that I felt as if I was being guided by a force beyond my own control. And I kid you not, I felt myself placing my foot on the first step of the staircase, slowly beginning to ascend against my own free will. I reached the top, feeling a cold sweat break out across my entire body, my heart pounding, but it felt as though I could not will my body to turn and leave. A deep sense of dread coursed through my veins, churning my stomach and making me feel weak as I was staring into the forest from the top of the stairs. And that's when I noticed the edges of my vision beginning to darken and fade. Only moments before I lost consciousness, I got a glimpse of a tall, dark looming figure standing in the trees, watching me from afar. Seconds later, I felt my legs begin to fold beneath me, and the sound of the horns faded to a peaceful silence. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed back at the cabin. Panicked, I reached for my phone in my pocket, checking the time, nearly midnight. My first thought was that I had actually come back from my hike early and had taken a nap, possibly having a nightmare in the process. My memory seemed hazy, and I was struggling to remember all the details. I dismissed my fear as being a part of my overactive imagination and the stress from my job working its way out of my system. I let out a sigh of relief and began to calm down. That's until I noticed I was still wearing my hiking shoes. I have been exhausted many times in my life, but never to the point that I would have worn my muddy hiking shoes to bed. A sudden and lingering feeling of being watched rushed over me as I remembered that the large panoramic window to my right remained fully uncovered and open to the inky black forest surrounding the cabin. My hands began to shake as I summoned my willpower to turn and face the darkness, assuring myself that there would be nothing there. To my despair, what I saw outside of that window against the backdrop of swirling darkness and moonlight was a tall, black figure, the head resembling the eyeless skull of a deer. Several sets of bony antlers twisted and snarl around the top of its head, framing the cracked and decaying bone and limply hanging jaw that composed the rest of its body. Its body seemed to be made of twisted branches and vines. I screamed, shuffling backwards and scrambling for my car keys on my nightstand beside my bed. I grabbed them, turning and bolting out of the cabin straight to my car, not even stopping to gather up my stuff. I turned the key in the ignition, and I was confronted with the terrifying creature standing straight ahead of me, fully illuminated by the headlights of the car. Without hesitation, I threw the car in reverse and spun around, speeding down the dirt road as fast as I could, and never daring to check my mirror. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment. After making it back inside, I checked my phone to see if I was able to take any pictures so that I could show or tell anybody about what happened, without them thinking I was crazy. But there was nothing there. I'm still not sure exactly what I saw back there, or what it was that I discovered. But all I know for sure is if you ever find a staircase in the woods, turn and run away as fast as you can. So this happened in the summer of 2020. I live in Colorado, and me and my buddy were both laid off because of the you-know-what, and we decided to go on a 22 or so mile hike in the mountains. It was this fairly well mapped out trail that was at about 12,000 feet elevation, and we figured that we're going to be out there for 2 nights. The first night we're exhausted, but we're making good time. We hike a bit off the trail and we set up a campsite. We marked the area where we went off the trail so we could find it again the next morning. Everything seems normal, so we go to get back on the trail that we marked, and we see this guy. We figure that he's homeless, but he's just sitting by a tree on the trail, waiting for us to come out. We try and talk to him, but there's no response. He just stares at us. Both of us were a little freaked out at this point. He looks like he's covered in dirt and possibly blood. We continue to hike and just leave him there, but we continue to keep our eyes peeled. The rest of the day is very uneventful. We have actually almost finished our hike, and we're going to set up camp mid-afternoon and just relax. We plan to smoke some weed, but before we do that, we still gotta find a place to set up camp. So eventually we go about 1.5 miles off the trail into the woods, and before we even settle in, this guy shows up again, just from out of nowhere, and whenever he walks by, he doesn't make a sound. We have no clue how he found us. We figure that he must have tracking skills. Also, we have no clue why, or how he even followed us for 9+ miles of rough terrain. No equipment or anything, especially without us knowing we were being followed. My buddy is enraged at this point. The guy just starts mumbling weird sounding gibberish under his breath. I can't even tell if it's English. We decided to leave the area, so we just hurry up and pack. The entire time, he is just standing there and watching us from 10 feet away. We finished the last bit of the hike in the light jog for like 4 miles. We're totally exhausted because of the elevation. We load up and we drive off, calling the nearest ranger station. We told them everything, but they didn't really seem to care. And if you're wondering exactly what he was saying, it was most likely incoherent stuff. But when he was just speaking nonsense, gibberish or whatever, I thought it sounded like he was speaking in some other language. He was mumbling a lot, so it was hard to tell, but it definitely sounded like there was a rhythm that I could make out sometimes, if that even makes sense. My friend, on the other hand, believes that this guy was possessed or being used as something, but God knows what. Always be careful when you go hiking or backpacking and you end up seeing the same person, well, the same stranger, twice in different locations. So I want to tell this story that I just remembered the other day. I'm still not sure what it was, but it sounds like what people in North America might call the Skinwalker, or some type of creature based on the stories that I have read. Now, I have told this story to other people, but here it goes. I would consider myself a kid back then. And by the way, this happened in the UK. So we go spend the summer at my uncle's place while he and my dad work on his house. My uncle lives with my grandmother and they have this huge house in the middle of the woods. It has a bunch of hills as well. As my dad and uncle work on the roof, I decided to go exploring in the gardens. A small clearing of land surrounds the house before it transitions into a thick woodland. I see a patch of no grass in this small area. I head over to see it, thinking that it was a log or something, but it happens to be a deer carcass, and it smells horrible. Deer are quite common in this area. I remember it. The flesh had been torn from nearly every bone, but from around the head. I start to feel a cold sweat and I just leave the area instead. I head back to the house. I climb up the roof using the ladder that was there, and I tell my uncle about what I saw. I remember him stopping as soon as I said that, and looking out towards the clearing that I was talking about. After a few seconds he says, "Don't worry about it. It's most likely a fox." Inside of my head I'm like, a fox? Are you fucking kidding me? But I do shrug it off and go inside and call it a day. Sometime later, about 2 weeks or so go by. Me and my uncle and dad head down to a local DIY store one morning to get some tools and other things. I don't remember everything we bought. This is nothing unusual, and then we head back home and have lunch. As we're eating, my grandmother says that while we were out, she saw a weird shadow, almost like an animal walking around in our driveway. She said it looks like a big dog. However, its hind legs were longer than its front, but it was just a shadow to her, so she couldn't see it very well. And me at this age, this scares the fuck out of me, and I immediately think about what I found the other day. My uncle, who had been deep in the woods plenty of times, tries to say that it was most likely a wild cat, or like a black panther or something, and that could have been a reasonable explanation, as in the 1970s, owning large cats was banned in England, so many people just decided to abandon all the animals they had by letting them free into the woods. But there was no way a big cat would go so close to our garden, not to mention our driveway, as they are very timid as far as big cats go. So I spend the next week or so nervous that I can't even go outside half the time. So a few weeks after my grandmother had sighted the weird creature, I had forgotten all about it by this point, and so would everybody else. On the final week, I have to stay at my uncle's before he and my dad have a 4-month break. The woods surrounding the house are on the side of a steep hillside, which apparently is popular with mountain bikers. Me, my dad, and my uncle decided to go into the woods because, why not? And to see how well it is for mountain biking. I completely forgot about the previous events before this, like I mentioned. So we go in through a gate at the bottom of our driveway and head into the forest. The air is musky. It's really hot, like 30 degrees, and it's also pretty dark. So after about 30 minutes into this, we're deep within the woods after heading in one continuous direction up this hill. There happens to be plenty of ways that we can go, since they're all different directions that have been left by bikers. We stop to look at our map, and all of a sudden, we hear this loud sound, and we all turn to see a good number of deer sprinting like lunatics up the hill. I was too excited about exploring to give a damn about this, but I happened to see that my uncle actually looks concerned, and he says that it's a good idea to keep heading up the hill. We get to the top of the hill, and we're outside of the woods at this point. We stay up there for a while, and my uncle says that we're gonna head back down in a few minutes. We head closer to the woods and we smell this pungent smell, something rotting. I know there wasn't any sewers up here, so I know it had to be something. We decide to head back down, and my uncle digs into his bag and he pulls out this huge blade. He then says that when he saw the deer running, that he saw something else, and that it was standing upright and had the posture of a dog or a big cat on its hind legs. In my head, I'm freaking the fuck out. I'm remembering what my grandmother said on the deer carcass. I see my dad in the corner of my eye holding a what the fuck face and almost laughing, calling my uncle crazy. Also, as a side note, ever since another one of my uncles died, I have 5 of them. 4 years prior to this, my uncle, the one I'm with now, started to act a bit crazy. So it's starting to get darker, and we start heading into the woods all the way down. My uncle is getting crazy. He is starting to squat down, telling us to be silent and to keep our eyes out. The smell continues with us all the way down. After 15 minutes or so, we can see the exit to our garden, but something is off. The lights are on. This is strange for us because the lights on the outside of the house are motion sensitive, and since our grandmother never goes outside by herself, it means that something the size of a human must have triggered them. They got a cool down time of about 30 seconds if I remember correctly. A minute later, we hear the screeching sound from about 100 meters behind us. Everyone basically jumps out of their skin, turning around to see this lanky, crooked, dark humanoid figure, about 2 meters tall from what I remember. We all completely lose our shit and start to run towards the gate. All the while, throughout this whole time, I can hear this thing running towards us as well. We run through the gate as fast as possible. When the garden lights decide to switch off, We happened to be in the pitch black and can't see anything. My dad, who's been holding my hand since we started running, pulls me nearly off my feet as he suddenly changes direction. He reaches the house and the lights turn on. We turn around to see darkness. My uncle, who was halfway down the drive when the lights turned on so we could see around us, runs up to us and says that he could see it just behind some trees. But the lights dazed him, so he lost sight of it. After about 30 seconds, the stench begins to fade. We head back inside and talk to my grandmother. We ask if she's alright. She said she's fine, but that she could hear someone talking and knocking on the doors the whole time that we were gone. After a few seconds of silence, I ask what the hell was that thing. My uncle tries to explain the big cat theory, and that it was most likely a panther standing on its hind legs. In my head, I quickly say BS, but we don't say anything else after that. We did spend one more week there, and then my dad and I took off. The house that my dad and uncle worked on was just completed 2 years ago. But mind you, this happened around 10 years ago, and ever since that night happened, my uncle just loaded up on all weapons and went pretty crazy. He was also diagnosed with severe depression, and also some mild form of OCD soon after that as well. I guess that sight, combined with the death of his brother, really did fuck him up mentally. But as soon as he finished the house, he ended up selling it and moved into the local town. Also, as far as I know, how it looked, the most detailed description that I can give is that it had a human head. There were no antlers or anything like that. I'm not sure what the hell this was, but if anybody has any idea, let me know. Before I begin, I just want to let everyone know I'm going to be sharing some of the ceremonies that are done in the res. Some of the things in the ceremony are not to be talked about, especially ceremonies like the shaking tent ceremony or the evil way. Now you might be asking why. Why shouldn't these things be talked about? Simply because it's a personal journey for some people. If you want to learn about it or need healing, I would recommend to go visit one. It's not really something to be published or shared in such a manner. Be very careful when digging into these things. If you really want to find out, you'll learn that some of these things are not to be taken lightly. So this happened to me when I was a kid, more like a teenager, and it was at my grandma's house where I grew up that I saw my first true skinwalker. I'll never forget that night, as long as I live. Ever since I was a little kid, I loved to go out and adventure and camp around in the hills behind my grandma's sheep camp, out on the eastern Navajo res. Every summer, once school was out, I would pack up my knife and all my scouting gear and head out to live with my grandparents for the summer, just so that I could learn how to be native and not so city-like, as my parents would always tell me. Mind you, I am Navajo. However, I'm not too familiar with the culture, as I grew up in the city itself. I love to go out and camp around in the hills behind my grandma's sheep camp, out on the eastern Navajo res. I would chop wood for the cooking stove, get water from the watering hole down the hill for my grandma's hogan, and also herd the sheep. I also like to go out and explore the surrounding hills and mesas, where I would also go out on my own to camp. Being that I was an All-American decorated Boy Scout from the big city of Albuquerque. So one July evening, I set out to the west to find a good campsite to have my summer adventures at, not knowing the bad luck the next few hours would bring. All I had taken with me was my survival knife, my gear, my radio, and my bag of goodies and dinner snacks that I would be cooking up later on that night. The sun was now setting, and I had to get to work on setting up my campfire. As I listened to my music, I gathered up firewood, chased some lizards, and 2 jackrabbits that got away from me. Too bad. They would have made a great dinner because, at that time, I was getting really hungry. It was all fun and games, and I loved it until that evening. as I was setting up a tent for my campsite and a place to put a small fire to roast marshmallows and hot dogs. I noticed someone, with what seemed to be an old-style lantern, doing something off in the distance. Out of curiosity, I moved in closer to get a better look, as it looked like they were burying something in the ground. Maybe they were burying a pet or some kind of treasure. A body? I hope not. Whatever it was. I was debating if I would tell my grandpa to call the Navajo police. With curiosity, I wanted to investigate what is going down the hill from where I was. Anyhow, it was weird to be doing such things at this hour, after the sun had set. I was told that Navajos don't do those things at night. Ever. As I got closer, I knew what it was the moment I saw it. By the soft dull glow of its light, I knew it was a skinwalker. My heart stopped, and I'll be honest, I peed on myself a little bit. I so much wanted to scream for help. I knew if I did so, that thing would be burying me next to whatever it had just buried as well. So I just lay there silent for a long time after it went on its way, not wanting it to see or hear me. After a while, I took a good look around, making sure that the coast was all clear. After that, I made my way back up the hill, back to my tent, and prayed until I fell asleep, never once starting my fire. I didn't want it to see my fire, so I stayed quiet in the darkness the whole time. The spot I had chosen was perfect at keeping me in a hiding spot. The small rock wall was my wind barrier, as the other surrounding rocks kept my tent hidden from the skinwalker. I was 2 miles from my grandma's place, and I didn't want to travel back in the darkness of the night with that thing lurking out. So I waited until sunrise. Then I went home after a quick nap. I was so tired from staying up all night, so when I woke up, I gathered my gear, covered up my fireplace along with my tracks, and ran back to my grandma's hogan. It was a little bit after midday when I finally got home. As I told my grandma what I saw, I got myself into more trouble by doing so. She and my grandpa were so mad at what I did and what I saw, so much so that my summer was now over, basically. I had to have a medicine man pray over me for 3 days and nights. It was known as a Navajo blackening ceremony, and it had to be done over me to chase away the evil that I had witnessed and got in contact with. What the medicine man told me next is something that I'll never forget. He said that the thing touched me while I was sleeping, and it also knew who I was. I guess when I woke up from my nap, I didn't notice the footprints it left beside me. Apparently, as I slept, it did its witching on me as well, and I thought they only did their evil at night. We later found out in another ceremony that thing was sent by a close family friend to my grandparents, and it was doing a witching towards them both to try to get their land and livestock from them. After finding all of that out, the medicine man had to do another ceremony. It was called the Evil Way, to send all that witchcraft back to the ones that were doing all the witching. After all was done, while he was packing up, the old Navajo medicine man told me a story about when he was my age. As he sat there eating a donut and drinking his coffee that my grandma made him, he told us how he would help his grandpa to do prayers and ceremonies for needful people at his grandpa's hogan. He said that one time, the first time that he saw a skinwalker shapeshift in front of him, he and his cousin were chopping wood for the ceremony's fire when they noticed a strange shape coming up to the hogan. He said that they both screamed into the night as they both ran inside to tell his grandfather that a skinwalker was coming to get them all. His grandfather just laughed and told the boys to calm down and not to be afraid, and that fear is what evil feeds on. He then told him to sit down and pray, and that no matter what, do not look at the evil or its face when it comes inside the holy place. Soon enough, this thing stepped inside the hogan and began to speak in Navajo to his grandfather. Its voice was very rough and shaky as it said hello in Navajo. It continued to speak in a polite manner and even introduced itself and spoke of its Navajo clan. Then it got down on its knees and begged for forgiveness. As this thing, this man, broke down and cried to the old medicine man. His grandfather patted the dark stranger on his head and back, blessing him with the smoke, the water, and the eagle feathers. They prayed for forgiveness, and they spoke of how the stranger would make a change into his new life. Then the old medicine man took some things and tossed them all into the fire, along with some cedar, to send the evil on its way back to the darkness. At that very moment, one of the visiting people in the meeting stood up and began to scream and curse at everyone in the room. With the eagle feathers in hand, the old man calmly splashed the blessed water into the deranged woman. At that moment, that person fell to the ground, ripped off her clothes, rolled into a ball, and crawled out of there. That was the first time I saw a naked woman, and to be honest, it scared me. The medicine man laughed to himself as he took a final sip of his coffee. He then said that they later had to track down where that witch had gone and take care of her and her witchcraft ways, basically meaning that they had to kill this woman, which was a skinwalker. After that story and that moment, well, it all sounds like adventurous fun and games, right? But as I later found out, it all comes at a price, a very dangerous price. But that's a story for another day. Addiction took our mom slowly. It rocked her through it, and it would sink her deep into sleep in the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell, she left them on the side of the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox. The missing pieces of her kept safe, so she wouldn't be lost forever, so that maybe one day we could put her back together. Our house fell down around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings had water damage, and the bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters, the radiators would bleed rust. But it was still our house, and Annie would make it into a home. My sister Annie would mother me with lopsided band-aids on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into bed later on, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet. She always let me shower first so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to shower with cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she caught the tingles. Annie was dark-haired, like her father, whoever he was. Annie was desperate to be blonde too, just like Mom. I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad, and I would give anything for her to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. I still dream about her, sometimes. Keeping up with our mom was impossible, and we learned from a young age we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier. When she was drinking light, she would shine. She would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes, dripping in cherry syrup. Sometimes when the weather was right, and she had enough of being drunk alone, she would call our school and tell them that we both had come down with summer sickness, and we would drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the backseat of the car coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her over our kitchen sink, and from behind, I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter. When she was drinking heavy, she would be out all night, hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she would be gone a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day, we would just wake up to an empty house and the fridge packed full, with a post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick in the outline of a kiss, telling us that she would be back home soon. Sometimes she would bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays. Smoke up to the ceiling. Mom would be lost in the haze. We would sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to drown out the music that would blast until the morning. and wake up two strangers at our kitchen table in the morning, asking us where we kept the coffee. When Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food. She would chain smoke, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up by the stairs like the wall were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, with her knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once when I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked over at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet, and then took every single cushion off the couch and into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch a while from the window and then sat next to me on the floor, backs pressed against the skeleton of the seeds. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She would laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything until her mouth started to shake and she started crying at the breakfast table into her cereal. Annie shut down when Mom was like this. Went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could harm her. She would stay up until the morning watching old black and white movies on the TV, whispering the lines that she knew by heart like prayers. When I was 5, I would cry when I would find my mom passed out cold on her bed, assuming that she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping just like the princess in my storybook. We would sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would be the one to put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes as she would piss herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October and I was 13. Annie was 16. It was a Wednesday night and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She had called us that morning from a payphone, with her voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoping that we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, that's when I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she got the money for them. We ate the birthday cake that she had made for me, with some sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness and the sea, and I enjoyed every bite and would scrape off sugar against my teeth. We watched the sun go down, Annie snapping grainy photos on her shitty phone as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she would just stay gone this time. But that Wednesday night, me and Annie, we weren't speaking. Anger was hanging heavy between us, seeping through the floor. It began when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We both laughed, Annie throwing her head back, gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I went down to pick her up, I caught a glimpse of her breath, warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. It was the smell of whiskey. I couldn't start picking her up too. I couldn't watch her fall again and again. And just like Mom, I knew that she would never get back up. I stared down at her, blonde hair falling into her eyes, and all I could see was our mom. And then I was running, feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turning loose. I ran for the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. It smashed between us on the floor, pieces of glass shining like we had dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them, pieces we could never put back. Outside through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. That was Annie, always trying to fix things, even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, stomach turning inside my rib cage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food, not made in a microwave. She had set the table, Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm. As we ate in silence, with every bite I would forgive her. Mom never cooked dinner, nor did she remember my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid, or stay sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane, and I cracked the window to let it out into the darkness. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off, crying. I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, throwing a fit, loud enough for us to catch. Or maybe even Lucky, the cat that junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around. But Annie always stopped me, saying that once he started giving, they would never stop taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs watching the skies. When we were little, we would sit outside and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized that she made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still like to play now, making up stories for the shapes that we could just pick out. Yeah, it's the course light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines, right next to the ashtray, left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, Annie said. She stopped laughing, voice quiet, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy. Let's wish. So we did. Then, the sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time, and it was definitely human. We turned to each other, confused. Annie shrugged, and I squinted out into the black. It must be Mika, I said, slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back? Shit, do you want to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply, and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain, fresh and clean and growing, a promise unfulfilled. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her, smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Get inside now. She was staring out into the dark past me, opening the door with one hand behind her. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I had found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person, crouched with their knees tucked up neat under the chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried, like a child, lost in the dark, but as someone pretending, mimicking the sound, open and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly, they got straight, snapping upright, face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. Panic made me move. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us. Hearing it bounce on its hinges as I locked it, we saw as the person slowly walked towards the house, with steps being deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight, and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around. I started to look over my shoulder out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face hard and shook her head. I knew then that she was being serious. Her voice cracked, and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in. I looked down at our fingers interlocked, both of us grown from the same bones. I'm gonna call the police and everything is gonna be... Her voice stopped, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like the promise of rain. Annie never cried. Your phone's on the porch, she whispered. Her phone was upstairs, charging. That's when a soft, tapping sound filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eyes becoming wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass. Slowly, over and over, they started to speed up, faster and harder, skin meeting the glass until they were slamming into the window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped, and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. We ran upstairs, 2 at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once, and Annie pulled my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom, locking the door. Crying sound tramped between the walls and the locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, feet jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife that she had grabbed from the kitchen. I was doing the same, shoulder to shoulder. Slow footsteps started on the stairs. The crying had become mocking, almost laughing sounds, shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the sound of it slamming open. It was looking for us. What the fuck is going on? I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. It was Mom's room. The next room on the hallway was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist. A red road, still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. Something slammed against the wall that was Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched sound then followed. I held my breath. I could feel my heartbeat in the base of my throat. I'm gonna get the phone from my room. I shook my head, ready to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand. I'm gonna get the phone, and I'm gonna call the police, and we're gonna be okay. I shook my head again. It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door, and you don't open it for anything or anyone. Promise me. I shook my head, and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips so it made my eyes water. Promise me, Em. Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. Promise. She mouthed and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, with the bolt scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hall outside, and then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut, just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, with the handle shaking up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles, and then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence. Nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. "Em," came a voice through the door. I was shocked. My hand started gripping the knife. "Honey, what's going on?" "Mom?" My voice cracked. "Mom, is that you?" I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. "Sweetie, it's okay. Just open the door. Just let me in." The handle started shaking again, except this time it was more gentle. "Just let me in. It's alright."
She banged on the door and I took my handle off the bolt. "Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. Please." Her voice broke and she started to cry. "Just let me in, sweetie. I'm so sorry." I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid, and I would come in off the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time, she did mean it. Maybe it was all gonna be okay, and that's when my hand found its way to the boat. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. "Emily, let us in. It's all okay." My hand froze on the bolt, and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. That's when a hand banged on the door, with the handle rattling. "Emily, let us in." Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. My mom was speaking now, pleading and crying, and the voice getting louder and louder. "Let us in, let us in, let us in," over and over again, punctuated by her fist on the door. I thought about demons and monsters, all the bedtime stories we pray don't crawl out from underneath the bed. "That's not my sister, and you're not my mom," I screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and crawled into a ball, with the knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. It wasn't the voice that yelled at when I changed the TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. Bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by the footsteps of people running. A low, guttural sound ripped through the house, filling the room until I felt like I was drowning in the sound, and then the door was kicked in. I screamed, covering my eyes, waiting to die. Somebody's arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long claw marks, dragged down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway, like it had snowed inside. I watched them slowly as men in uniforms checked each of the rooms, and each of the rooms looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, covered in blue and red lights as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel. I threw myself from the shoulders of the cop and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which was also rocking. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly that it made my chest ache as I understood. It turns out this was no demon, no wild animal or creature or bad man trying to break in. It was just Mom, out of her mind on alcohol and drugs and everything else in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head, and this time we couldn't put her back together, no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time, and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her arms like unmapped roads, real thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She had searched the kitchen for all the drink I had thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, she had come to hunt for the stash that she hid in the bathroom. She didn't want me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, and she was so high that she could mimic Annie's voice so perfectly. It turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly, the kind that come in a bottle, or a needle, or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes, the monsters are the ones that raise you, or love you the most, but it's up to you if you let them in.
I had a dream. I'm not sure what it meant, or if it was real. Well, I mean, I know it wasn't real, but I'm pretty sure something was going on. Let me start this off by saying that I am deeply curious about the unexplained. Those topics don't often make appearances in my dreams, let alone to this level of detail. It was an unremarkable evening a few years ago. I can't recall any distress or commitments the next day that would have disrupted my sleep or dreams. And I also hadn't been drinking. I simply fell asleep at a normal hour, just like I would every night. The dream began with me asleep on the floor of a basement that I'd never been in before. It looked very familiar, but it wasn't a perfect match to any basement that I've been in. I then woke up wrapped in a blanket, an old flat pillow under my head. My back hurt and my eyes felt itchy. Even though I didn't have glasses on, I could see perfectly well after rubbing my eyes. The room was dark, except for a single blue light that I assumed was coming from a TV or a game console or something. All around me were other sleeping people that I assumed were friends of mine. They were all laying on the floor, but nobody was moving or made any noise. I glanced over to the stairs at the back of the room, and my blood ran cold. There was a strange figure, stocky and standing at about shoulder height, walking across the room. He was draped in what it looked like a purple bedsheet with yellow patterns on it. His skin was a dull brown-green, and his face seemed almost frog-like. He had front-facing white eyes, with no pupils and a long slit-like mouth. A long black beard hung down from his chin over his chest. He was wearing some kind of hat that curled backwards behind his head. His arms and fingers were long and thin, and protruded from his baggy sleeves. His movements were unlike anything I'd seen in my life. It was almost like someone moving underwater. I couldn't see his feet, so it looked like he was floating along the ground. His arms were moving very smooth at his sides as he quote-unquote walked. That's when he turned his head to face me, and that's when I heard his voice. "Can you see me?" I didn't hear a voice say it. It was like the words were in my brain, but I didn't put them there. I could tell they came from him though. I nodded. I was a bit scared, but I had this gut feeling that he wasn't dangerous, which is what actually kept me from panicking. In my head, I thought about what I was going to say, and was alarmed when he answered me in the same manner as before. "I can see you," I said. "What are you doing down here?" And he just repeated, "You can see me." "Yes, I can see you. Is everything alright?" There was silence. "Yes, don't be afraid." I stood up and walked over my sleeping friends towards him. As I did, I replied, "I'm not, but who are you?" His answer still lingers inside of me. "I am you, in a way. I control you. We are each other." Immediately, this strange warmness rose in my stomach. I was overcome with this feeling of joy and friendship. "So you control me, like a video game." I even did the hand movement of holding a controller for him, and he made a nervous laugh. "Not exactly. In a way, yes. It's hard to explain, but I'd rather not. But yes, it's nice to see you. People are how we experience. We live inside of you. We don't move around by ourselves." Another pause came as I tried to figure out what to say next. "I have to leave. It was nice seeing you, but you won't see me again." And with that, he was gone. No flash of light, no fading out. He was there 1 second, and gone the next. From there, I woke up in my bed. Nothing strange happened since then. No missing time, no marks or changes in my life. I just moved on, and sometimes I'll think about it, but I have yet to see him again. I did tell this to a friend, and what he told me kind of stood out. When we're dreaming, we're in the spiritual side. This plus the fact that this thing is hideous leaves no other conclusion that you were having a talk with a demon. that is possessing you. They're not supposed to be seen. That's why the demon was surprised. As for how it does control, this thing is whispering thoughts into your mind, the same way that they communicate. Only when this is happening during the day, you have no way to know. Almost like when you tell yourself, these aren't my thoughts or what I'm thinking. I'm not sure what to think, but maybe those thoughts that we come across in our head sometimes isn't really us thinking about it. It might be somebody or something else inside of us, possessing us, putting these things in our head. I'm not sure if this is still correct, but I find it weird that science still hasn't found a solution as to why we dream. But there are several theories and explanations. But as far as why, nobody really knows. It's kind of scary when you think about it. What if the things that we dream are things that are happening in the spiritual realm? Be careful when you go to sleep tonight. My boyfriend and I were staying in a tiny home in Navajo Nation, right across from Monument Valley in 2019, that was solar powered. It was an Airbnb, and it was one of the last stops on a road trip through Colorado and Utah. There was an outhouse for a bathroom that you had to access by going outside. The area is very beautiful. The tiny home is on a cliffside with a spreading view of all of Monument Valley. Behind it are also large red rock formations with hiking trails. There's also a few homes around, but very spread apart. It has a strong energy about it, and there were some petroglyphs on some of the rock formations around the tiny home. We arrived in the early afternoon and settled in. As night was falling, my boyfriend called his dad to tell him that we had arrived, and also to let him know where we were. His dad had some experience in Navajo Nation, as he's come to the area before to do a sweat tent ceremony, and he told us he always felt off there, well, around the area that we were in. He then told us, watch out for those skinwalkers, and we had both not heard about them before, so we just laughed to ourselves about him being fearful over something unreal. We got off the phone and my boyfriend started looking up a skinwalker. After a few minutes, he looked over at me and said, well, the worst thing that happens is that we can die. And I kid you not, at that moment, all of the power in the cabin went out, completely. It was very dark, and this tiny home had huge glass windows showing the whole interior. While earlier it was beautiful because it showed views of the landscape, now it seemed very scary, almost like walking into a portal, into the unknown. So we were both scared to death, and of course, the only way to use the bathroom was to go outside, despite our efforts to contact the Airbnb owner, likely because of the late hour. Also, since we were only staying for the night, we decided it wasn't worth to make an argument. However, we both did sleep poorly that night. We tossed and turned, unable to find rest, and I swear, we would hear noises echoing outside. We didn't know what the noises were. We just ended up right next to each other, too afraid to even glance towards the windows for fear of what might be out there. We don't believe in the paranormal, which is why we laughed when my father-in-law said to watch out for skinwalkers. Thankfully, nothing happened from there. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the big-ass windows, we spent no time in packing up our belongings, and I'll be honest, we didn't even bother brushing our teeth or using the bathroom again. We were just trying to get the fuck out of there as quickly as possible. However, as I was taking some stuff outside to the car, I saw a pack of feral horses standing right outside of our window. They weren't right next to the window, but they were across from it, and one of them felt like was staring into my soul. I went outside to take photos, and I felt like it was trying to lead me away back into the large red rocks. It truly felt like there was energy in that area, almost like it was reminding us that it was there, it's still alive, especially because we scoffed at it. Overall, it was a really cool experience, but it was a bit humbling and a little scary as well. After we left, My boyfriend called his dad again, and I won't forget what he said at the end. He said, "Whatever you think it was, you didn't see it, and you don't talk about it. Don't give them power." I grew up near the reservation. I also have 2 family members that are Navajo. There are some creepy things out there for sure. I felt things and I heard a lot of stories from my brothers. One thing that happened to me as a teenager was super creepy. We were driving through the rest to get to Colorado for a concert. Out in the middle of nowhere, we saw an old woman walking on the side of the road. She was traditional Navajo, Denye, with a velvet skirt and her hair tied with a cotton string. I remember thinking it was a little weird that she was in the middle of nowhere and no houses were around, and that she was elderly. She looked at us as we drove past her. About 20 miles later, we saw her again and she looked at us, and it was the same lady. It did creep all of us out. It might be possible that she had a twin or something, but I'm good with faces, and it was the same woman. I do wonder what would have happened if we had stopped. All I know is that when you see somebody twice, it means something. Like either someone is trying to draw you. Like when you see the same dog or person twice, it might seem wrong that we didn't stop and actually offer her a ride. But growing up around the area, we knew it wouldn't have been appropriate. Plus our car was full. She didn't look like she was in distress or anything. And when we saw her again, none of us said anything for a while. We were all so creeped out. Her face was also blank. Not friendly or unfriendly, just blank. I told my brother, he's my husband's half-brother and is half Denye, and he said she was likely a spirit. I will add that he didn't think it was scary. He said that she was more of a guardian spirit. He is Navajo, and his father is very active in the tribe, and he was raised very traditional. All I know is that everybody in the reservation always says, if you see something that you're not supposed to see, you didn't see it. I spent most of my life in Georgia and love hiking all over, but I must admit, North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, that's where I drive up there to go hiking and camping. This time, I went up there with my family and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain Trailhead, and I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a gun with me, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was very tiring, not even steep. I hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of ups and downs and feeling like it wouldn't end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up right now that I still had light. So I stopped about half a mile short of the summit, and I figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot. I ate my food and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't ran into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon would be. I had trouble sleeping, and I lay awake for about an hour trying to sleep. During this time, as I was drifting away, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the footsteps. I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull my big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. The morning came, and I woke up and ate oatmeal. As I was eating, I looked over at my tent, and that's when I noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with green cord propped against my tent. Inside of me, I was pissing myself, but I packed up all my shit and took off within 5 minutes. And damn right, I didn't even bother going to the summit. Instead, I went straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended, and I was lost. I had to use a compass to eventually find the trail again, and I made it out with no other incident. However, I came to find out the same morning that a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me, and it's possible I would have ran into him had I not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. I have looked around, and his family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him. His name was Chad Seeger, if anyone cares to look him up. On many of the articles, people mention about getting lost on the trail and the fog. I'm not sure if there was some sort of connection with what I found beside my tent and Chad Seeger disappearing. What if there was somebody out there? Or something. I'm not sure what happened. But what if there was only 3 of us in that area? Me, Seeger, and whoever put this thing beside my tent. The scariest part for me was knowing that someone or something knew where I was and was watching me, and I had no clue about them. I love camping, but after my most recent trip, I don't think it will ever be the same. I set up my tent on nice, flat ground and collected some wood for a fire. The night came with all its nightly sounds, and I relaxed at the owls and chirping crickets. Even better was the fact that no one else was around. Hell, it was subtle. I almost missed it. The voice came from deep within the woods, and for a moment, I didn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded almost like a female, but strange enough, I just couldn't tell. Please help. It continued. I shined my flashlight between the bushes and walked around. To be completely honest, even as a grown man, I was paralyzed with fear. So, I did the responsible thing and called the local police. That's when things went from being odd to very, very weird. The police actually told me to ignore it. I explained to them that someone could be injured and maybe needed medical attention, but they assured me otherwise. When I kept pushing and asked why, they told me, "Sir, if you ever hear that voice again, ignore it, do not respond, and do not approach." Well, I did hear it again, but I didn't ignore it. It was almost midnight when I heard the voice a second time. I awoke to someone whispering, "Help," and it sounded like she was just outside my tent. I went outside to check and no one was there, but the voice continued from a distance. "Help, please." Again, I grabbed my flashlight and looked around the area I was camping. I was too afraid to follow the voice into the woods, especially since the authorities themselves avoided it. But I struggled morally, trying to decide whether I should go and help this person or listen to the police, who were concerned for my safety. But then, I heard another, different voice. This other voice, which also seemed to be coming from the woods, was an octave lower. Unlike the first one, which cried for help, this one was loud and demanding.
"Quiet.
The other voice demanded.
No one's going to help you."
Once I heard that, I was pretty sure someone was in trouble, so I called the police again. When I informed them about a second voice coming from the woods, they seemed even more concerned. They told me that I should pack up my things and leave the campsite immediately. They said that hearing the second, more manly voice meant that it was getting desperate. They also said that the 2 voices were coming from the same person. That part was bizarre and confused me, to say the least. It was at this point I dismissed the police in that area as crazy, but not before telling them off. I got angry. I told them that if they didn't get down here to come and check it out, then I would do it myself. I said that a woman could be in serious trouble and that it was their job to help her, but they still refused to come. All they kept repeating to me over the phone was, "Do not enter the woods, sir." They actually seemed more afraid than I was. Once I hung up the phone, I heard the voices again. A gentle, "Please, somebody help me." And then a growling,
Quiet. No one's coming.
It was a little past midnight at that point. I couldn't live with myself knowing that I had the chance to save someone's life, but instead became a coward. So I grabbed some things and ventured into the woods. When I entered the woods, the voices ceased. Just like that. No cries, no whispers, and no commands. Even the owls and crickets went away. Nothing but dancing leaves and creaking tree branches. I stopped walking and looked around, a full 360 degrees. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out. Nothing. "I'm here to help," I continued. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Still, nothing. I thought of calling the police again, then chuckled to myself. I found it strange, but somewhat comforting that I didn't find anyone out there. Regardless, I was still creeped out, so I packed my things and finally left the campsite. I didn't know why the police, of all people, were so afraid. Worst case, someone was in actual danger, and we all failed them. To be honest though, when I heard the voice the very first time, I did think it was a joke. When I heard it the second time, along with that other voice, I became a bit more concerned. And same with the third time I heard it in the woods. However, when I heard it again, for the fourth time, a week after I left the campsite, coming from inside my own house, I became very, very concerned. Before I start, I feel like I should let something very clear. I love Ellen. We've been living together for about 3 years now. In fact, we were childhood friends. And I know this may sound like a fairy tale to some people, but it truly felt like we were always destined to be together. Even after graduation, when we started dating other people, it only felt truly right when we were with each other. So I don't know what took me so long to ask her out, but I'm really glad that I did. We have the same taste in music, in movies, and even food. We laugh at the same dumb jokes, and we know exactly how to comfort each other in times of need. She's the kindest, most gentle, and loving girl I ever met. We even been talking about our plans for marriage, and how we would like to have kids of our own. And this is why it hurts so much how it all went terribly wrong in just 4 nights. I would also like to say that Ellen doesn't have much of a family other than me, and some very distant aunts that she never met, and that she doesn't even know their names. I was born in a big family, with 4 siblings and plenty of cousins that were always visiting us, and even helping out when we got in trouble. Ellen has none of that. She doesn't have any siblings, and her father was an alcoholic, abusive freak that died when she was young. Her mother was a very kind and inspiring person that took care of the family by herself for many years, and almost a second mother to myself, you can say. So when she passed away last year, it hurt us both for a long time. But Ellen stays strong. She's not the type to let her feelings easily surface, so you gotta be a lot more perceptive to get what she truly feels. I used to pride myself in being capable of that. I felt like I knew her better than I knew myself. That's why this is all so strange and frankly terrifying. We were sleeping in bed and I was dreaming. I don't remember what it was about until I heard her voice very close to my ear.
Knock, 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 knock.
She was caressing my hair gently while sitting in bed and looking below at me. I slowly opened my eyes, groggy from sleep. Hey, what is it, babe? She kept looking at me and repeated,
Knock, 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 knock.
I looked over at the digital clock on top of the dresser. 3:27 a.m. I had work in only a few hours. Hey, what is it, Ellen? She paused for a second.
Knock, 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 knock.
Fine, I accepted, mostly because I was expecting some kind of surprise. Ellen wasn't the type to do what she was doing for no reason. Who's there? Her smile opened up, and she answered.
Not me, so don't answer the door.
I kept looking at her, dumbfounded. Is that it? Is that the joke?
Yes.
She said, laying in the couch and covering herself with a blanket.
Thank you for answering.
Weirdo, I answered, closing my eyes and going back to sleep. The next morning things went as normal. I only remember the strange conversation while I was alone in the bathroom, brushing my teeth. I wasn't even sure if it had truly happened, or if it was just a weird dream. So we had our breakfast together, and she was acting normal, reading something from a fashion magazine. Frankly, I wasn't paying much attention, so I took the opportunity to ask about last night. Initially, she didn't seem to know what I was talking about. Then, she fixed her eyes on me, and the same smile from last night crossed her face, just briefly. And I knew it wasn't just a dream. She told me it wasn't anything important, and she stopped paying attention when I started asking more. And even though I shouldn't, I gave up. I had work and other matters to attend to, and I just brushed off the weird event, thinking it wouldn't happen again. But the following night, I woke up to her voice.
Knock, knock.
A pause.
Knock, knock.
What is it now? I said. Ellen, what are you doing?
Knock, knock.
She repeated. This time, she wasn't even touching me, just sitting in bed, looking at me with that same smile, but her eyes seemed larger, and she blinked in longer intervals. I looked at the clock, and once again, 3:27 a.m. Ellen, come on. What is it? I got work in a few hours. I can't be waking up in the middle of the night to answer some knock-knock jokes.
Knock, knock.
This is getting creepy, you know. I'm not sure if this is some kind of joke you've been doing, but I don't like it.
Answer it. Knock, knock.
I sighed, but also let a small laugh escape. It was creepy, of course, but she was my Ellen, but it didn't bother me as much as it should. Alright, fine. Who the fuck is there? I answered in a playful tone.
Not me, so don't answer the door.
For some reason, I felt a chill down in my spine. It was the same answer as before, and I still didn't get what it meant. But the way she said it, with a strange, monotone voice, contrasted well with her smile and the fact that I had no idea what she meant by that. What does that mean? I asked. I really don't get it. She just smiled and went back to sleep. The next day, we talked again about what was happening. She was starting to ignore my questions, and I barely got her to say anything. It was almost like she couldn't talk about it, which was very off, considering we talk about pretty much everything. I told her I needed to be well rested for work, something she should understand well, and wasn't liking her little gag every night, as I didn't want to hurt her feelings. When I got back home, we had dinner, we watched the movie, and went to bed.
Knock, knock.
I opened my eyes faster this time around. In fact, I barely got any sleep. I just knew she would do it again, and kept thinking about it the whole time. I glanced at the clock. 3:27 a.m.
Knock, knock.
I thought about ignoring her, just pretending I was asleep. and she wouldn't wake me up, so I closed my eyes slowly, hoping that she hadn't seen me opening them in the first place, and stayed quiet.
Knock, knock.
She continued. She didn't stop. I controlled my breathing, but she kept going.
Knock, knock.
I'm not answering your fucking joke, Ellen. Stop it.
Knock, knock.
I ignored, but she kept going. She had never been this insistent with anything before. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting on my nerves. And frankly, I felt scared. Why the fuck was Ellen doing this? Why every night? And at the same exact time down to the minute? Why wouldn't she let me sleep until I answer her?
Knock, knock.
I got up in a sudden movement. Ellen, god damn it. I was ready for a discussion, but when I finally glanced at her, it was almost like everything was drained from me. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't blinking. Just staring right at me like an animal. And her mouth was moving slowly, and she didn't stop.
Knock, knock.
I didn't know how to react or what expression I had when I saw her, but my heart skipped a beat. It was terrifying, as if her gaze froze me in place. 1,000-yard stare.
Knock, knock.
Who's there? I asked, feeling as if it was the only way out of that fucking nightmare.
Not me, so don't answer the door.
Ellen slowly closed her eyes and lay down. I kept staring at her while she fell into what seemed to be a deep sleep. I got up and left. I walked downstairs and sat down at the couch in the living room, staring at the night sky outside and soaking the quietness of the neighborhood. My heart was beating fast and it didn't slow down. I was too scared to sleep in the same room as my girlfriend, all because of a fucking knock-knock joke. But it was unnatural. I thought about calling someone. I thought about it all being some kind of sleep-related issue, such as some type of sleepwalking, but it didn't make any sense. I felt so tired and decided that early in the morning I would call an old friend who's a psychologist and get the opinion of a professional. I knew something was wrong with Ellen. I stayed in the couch as the day rose, and once Ellen woke up, she was acting normal again. Even asked me why I wasn't in bed. I didn't answer. In fact, I didn't talk to her and simply left for work. She seemed very upset, but I wouldn't do anything about it. Once I got to work, I called my friend. I told him everything that was happening, with every single detail as I'm describing right now. He didn't seem as worried, but we agreed in making an appointment for next week. Now, I just needed to convince Ellen to come with me. I received plenty of text messages from her. She seemed very worried, sad, and even confused. She apologized a lot, and it broke my heart a little bit. I felt bad. I shouldn't have, but I answered her and made her promise it wouldn't happen again. I also told her about the appointment, and she hesitated for a moment, but she agreed to go with me, so we made up. This was Ellen, after all, the girl I knew ever since I was 6 years old, the woman I loved, that had taken care of me for many years, and as much as the strange behavior creeped me out, she wasn't actually doing anything scary or even dangerous. So for a while, I convinced myself I should give her another chance. When I returned home from work, we stayed together. She even got my favorite meal ready. Ellen was acting as gentle and caring as I always remember, and I slept with her in our bedroom, even though I didn't want to.
Knock.
I couldn't believe it. She fucking promised me she wouldn't.
Knock.
I gazed at the clock. 3:27 a.m.
Knock.
I was laying on my stomach, and I couldn't see her face. In fact, I didn't even bother to look at her. I was feeling more sad than scared at this point. Sad that she had broken her promise.
Knock.
Who's there? I answer, determined to just go back to sleep.
Not me, so don't answer the door.
I stayed quiet, and I closed my eyes. I just hoped I would be able to handle it until the appointment next week. To my surprise, I was actually able to sleep. Maybe because I hadn't been able to rest since last night. The following morning, I went back to not saying anything to Ellen, only very limited responses. I was expecting her to act same as yesterday, trying to apologize, but she didn't. Mostly she didn't even say anything, almost as if she had accepted it. She also looked tired, or at least a bit weak. I went to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. I didn't receive any messages. Once I got back, we had the most silent dinner I ever had in my life, and she barely ate anything. I decided to let her have the bedroom, and I would end up sleeping on the sofa. I wasn't sure if it would stop her, but I held on to the hope that she wouldn't go downstairs, only to tell me the same fucking knock-knock joke again. I covered myself with a blanket, shaked off the uneasy feeling, and tried to get some sleep. I had a deep sleep, without dreams. I felt like I was lost in darkness. Then, I heard somebody. I opened my eyes, and I saw Ellen, standing above me, looking at me with big eyes and dilated pupils that didn't seem to belong in such a completely neutral expression, watching me sleep. I almost screamed in fear, jumped out of the couch, and her eyes followed me as I stumbled across the dark room, creating distance between us. For a moment, I was able to glance at the clock above the table, 3:27 a.m. "Ellen, what the fuck are you doing?" I asked, desperate, but she didn't move. In fact, she didn't say anything. She just stared at me, as if I was made of glass and she could see right through me. Then, I heard a knock on the front door. I looked over in that direction, and it was followed by another knock, and another. Someone almost pounding at the door. I glanced back at Ellen, and she was still staring at me. Slowly, I got closer to the door and she didn't move. The pounding continued. "Who's there?" I screamed. It stopped, and then I heard a voice.
John? John, can you hear me? Open the door, please. John, please, open the door.
I froze in place. The voice kept calling me, but I couldn't believe it. It was Ellen's voice, coming from the other side of the door. But it couldn't be.
I beg you, John, open the door. She's not me.
Slowly, I turned my head to look at Ellen, standing in front of the couch, and she was looking at me with the same eyes and a terrible, wide grin across her face. The pounding continued.
John, open the door, please.
I stayed still, not knowing what to do. And then, I don't remember what happened after that. I just woke up in my bedroom. The digital clock indicates 4:21 a.m. Ellen isn't by my side. I'm completely alone. I'm trembling uncontrollably, and I'm not sure what's going on. I don't remember what happened after I saw her terrible grin. I'm not even sure if I opened the door. I tried to look for my phone, see if I could call the police, or at least someone that I know, but I left it downstairs. All I have is Ellen's laptop, and it's where I'm writing this right now, to get some sort of advice, because I know I can't go downstairs. Everything is dark, very dark, almost as if the shadows are leaning into the room, and I can also hear a low, scratching sound. What should I do? Driving across the country is not something I enjoy. I used to not mind it so much back when I wasn't required to do it every other week. I work in the sales department for the largest office supply company in the Midwest. Basically, my job is to contact various other businesses offices and firms and sell them office supplies in bulk. This all used to be done virtually, but after one business requested a meeting for the sale, I was sent to do the interview just like how they were done before the digital age. Apparently, my sales pitch and presentation were so enjoyable that the word came back to my boss and they promoted me, a new position that required I conduct these in-person meetings pretty often. I received a significant pay raise, plus commission. I was also reimbursed for most of my travel expenses. It's just after you've been doing these business trips for so long, the journey itself becomes pretty repetitive and boring. Some of you might ask, why don't you just fly like a normal person? Well, I like things to be a certain way. I like to have as much control of my surroundings as possible. Versus when you go flying, you forfeit that control for convenience. If I fly and lose my luggage or have any issues with the car rental place, then I'm basically out of luck. Or if the job goes poorly and I have to head back home before my scheduled time, I'll need to reschedule a flight, and that by itself is just a pain. So unless the location is extremely far away, I just prefer to travel my own way. Recently, I had a job come up which was in the southern part of Kansas. Having been through Kansas only once in my life previously, I can't say I was actually excited to revisit. The drive to the company was fine. Actually, it was one of the smoother trips I had taken in a while. Very little traffic and clear blue skies for as far as the eye could see. I had arrived at around 4 in the afternoon and conducted the meeting upon arriving. The meeting lasted roughly an hour and a half, though most of that time was spent sitting in a waiting room. After all was said and done, all parties involved seemed to be satisfied. I quickly called my boss to inform him of the new account that we had just acquired, and he said good work. My boss wasn't what you would call a people person, which is also why I was the one doing these meetings and not him. However, I could tell he was quite pleased. You work with someone for so long, you pick up on a few things. I tossed my briefcase into my car and hit the road. After driving for nearly 2 hours, the road and the horizon were starting to blur together. With a yawn, I looked down at the time. It was about to be 8 p.m. The burnt orange sky was quickly fading into a dark blue. As I sat there fidgeting in my seat, the feeling of having to use the bathroom was beginning to creep upon me. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of a turnoff for a fast food restaurant or even a gas station. However, no sign was to be seen. It was just a mile marker after mile marker, and they were passing by at a rapid pace. There were no turnoffs, at least not that I could see. I grabbed my phone off my dash and began to pull up my GPS. I needed to find the nearest rest area quickly. However, before I could scan my phone, I glanced up to maintain my position on the road, and I saw a dual blue sign appear on the right. Rest stop in 5 miles, it read. I closed my phone and with a smile, I placed it back on its stand relieved. I relaxed back into my seat and continued driving. As I was quickly approaching mile 5, I couldn't seem to spot the rest stop in the distance. I was starting to become concerned, and after another 10 stressful minutes, a building began to appear on the horizon. Seeing an entranceway, I turned the wheel and pulled in. The rest stop didn't seem like anything special, but by that point, I didn't care. I just needed to use a bathroom. I hopped out of my car, and when I did, I noticed I wasn't alone at this place. There was a truck sitting a few yards away, parked near the door to the building. I briskly walked towards the building, and as I passed by in front of the truck, I felt like somebody had their eyes on me. I turned my head and saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. He was wearing sunglasses, just sitting there with both hands on the steering wheel. He didn't seem to be looking directly at me though, just in my general direction. Aside from his sunglasses, I couldn't get a good look at his face with how dark it was becoming, but I pushed the whole situation out of my mind and continued onward. As I was leaving the bathroom, I noticed a vending machine. I bought a Snickers and stepped outside. When I did, I looked up and saw that the truck was gone. It was in that moment that a feeling of isolation started to creep up in the back of my mind. Now, I knew I had been alone in this entire trip, but for some reason, that feeling of being by myself became painfully apparent. I looked around for a few moments to see if anyone else was nearby. After shaking the weird thoughts from my mind, I hopped back into my car and returned to the highway. Once I was driving, I started to calm down. I even put on some music to help me get out of my own head. After driving for another hour, I spotted something on the side of the road, a blue sign that said, "Rest stop in 5 miles." When I read those words, a chill came over me and that feeling of isolation returned. I tried my best to get rid of the feeling from my mind. However, before I could shift my mind into something else, I saw it, the same exact rest stop. I slowed down a bit and looked at it. It was identical to the one I had previously stopped at. I tried to rationalize that the state had simply copied and pasted their rest stop design. I looked away and sped up, and I continued along the highway. I drove for another 2 hours, and by that point, the sun had set and had been replaced by the moon and stars above. Admiring the clear sky overhead, my eyes drifted down, and I saw it again. That same exact sign. Rest stop in 5 miles. I didn't want to stop at this place again, simply because this whole area was starting to creep me out. I had been driving pretty much non-stop since I left. I needed a break. And again, the same building appeared, and against my better judgment, I pulled into the parking lot. As I parked my car, my eyes drifted to the left, and I saw that same exact truck from before, in the same exact spot as before. I squinted my eyes a bit, but it was now far too dark to see if anyone was inside. I sighed, not wanting to be here any longer than necessary. I went to reach for the door handle, but then I stopped. That feeling from earlier, that feeling of eyes on me, came back. There was someone standing in front of my car's headlights. Whoever it was wasn't there a moment ago. I turned and looked at them. It was a man, just standing there in front of my car. He seemed to be wearing sunglasses, even though it was quite odd given it was the middle of the night. He wasn't moving. His arms hung limply at his side. I was able to roll down my window and call out to him, asking what his problem was. But then one of his arms began to move. It slowly lifted to his face and peeled away his dark sunglasses. His eyes were missing. 2 dark holes in his face. And despite him not having eyes, it still felt like he was watching me. He continued standing there, not moving a single muscle aside from removing his sunglasses. My steering wheel began to creak and groan as I gripped it tighter and tighter. Then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. He was no longer standing in front of my car. I exhaled, trying to gasp the air back in. A moment later, my heart started aching as it pounded in my chest. Then, that feeling came back. The feeling of those eyes, watching me. I slowly turned to my left, and that face was inches away from my driver's side window. I was so close to him. I could see the reddish black skin shifting around as if there were still eyes inside looking at me. He pressed a single hand on my window, and I fucking screamed as loud as I could. I slammed my car in reverse and nearly crashed trying to spin my car around. I drove towards the exit of the rest stop, and instead of continuing the same way I had been, I turned left and decided to drive the other way this time. For nearly 45 minutes of driving, I could barely control my breathing. Every time I think I had gotten it under control, I would lose some air. I could barely bring myself to think about those empty eyes, let alone start rationalizing what that thing was. I drove for another hour before I spotted something up ahead on the right, a small roadside diner. There was a big sign out in the front that said, "Open 24 hours a day." I immediately pulled inside and parked. I just sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to collect my thoughts. During that time, I kept looking back over my shoulder to make sure whatever that thing was had him follow me. I stepped outside and entered the diner. A small bell announced my arrival. I saw that the inside was virtually empty. There was a single man who seemed to be a trucker sitting at the counter, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. He gave me a passing glance and continued reading. A moment later, a waitress came rushing out of the back and told me to grab a seat anywhere. I spotted a booth near the back and quickly walked over to it. I sat down, rubbing my hands together, trying to shake off my nervousness. The waitress came over to the booth and asked if she could give me anything, with a slightly trembling voice. I just said a cup of coffee. A few moments later, she came back, and with a cup in hand, taking note of my clearly unsettled appearance, she said if there was anything going on. I just told her I had been driving on Route 83 for a few hours and needed a break. When I told her this, she returned a confused look. She asked me if I was sure I was on Route 83, and when she did, I noticed the trucker turned and raised an eyebrow at my statement as well. I nodded to her, and she told me something that I'll never forget. She said that most of Route 83 had been closed for a few weeks now, that there are roadblocks and signs all over the road itself. She also said that there's an ongoing investigation about recent disappearances that all seem to be happening in one area, near a lonely rest stop. Having to move into a new place can be a complicated process. You're basically uprooting your entire life and adjusting to your new surroundings. The finances and planning that go into such an endeavor can also be quite stressing if you're not ready, which is what happened with my situation. I had recently finished college and was currently staying with my parents. Not an ideal situation, but my mother invited me to stay as long as I provided some sort of rent. I had been staying home for roughly a year, and towards the latter months I had been searching for a new place that didn't have my parents hanging around at every turn. Towards the end of the year, my parents had informed me that they had just sold our house and were getting ready to move to the southern part of Florida. This took me by surprise as I wouldn't be able to go with them because of my work obligations. This made me find a new place to live as soon as possible. Just about all the apartment complexes in my area wouldn't have any vacancy for weeks or months, and most other places weren't even accepting applications. Getting concerned and my options becoming more limited by the day, a posting was submitted for a house on the other side of the city. It was a place for rent, and the owner didn't really seem that big on official procedures. They probably hadn't rented homes very often before. I reached out to them with my information, and they approved me only after a few days of speaking with me and reviewing my application. I exhaled a sigh of relief and was able to move in not long after. Thankfully, I don't own that much stuff, only about a bedroom's worth of belongings, so my moving costs remain fairly low. When I pulled up to the location, the renter was standing outside of the house. It was an older woman who had a deep southern accent. She was very nice and respectful. We walked throughout the house, and being honest, it wasn't much to write home about. It was a tiny single-story house with a built-in garage that could barely hold a bicycle, let alone an entire car. Overall, I was quite content with it, and the truth be told, I was just happy to have a place to live and not have to worry about moving anymore. As we approached the front door, something caught my attention. On the side of the door was what appeared to be a camera mounted into the wall. I asked the woman what this was exactly, and she mentioned that the previous owners of the house were concerned about home security, so they installed a security system throughout the house. She mentioned there being a camera at the back door as well. I was a bit surprised that someone would actually come out here for home security, given the house itself and the surrounding area, but I guess you can't really put a price on peace of mind, I thought. We finished the walkthrough, and I signed all the required documents before moving into my new home. The owner also handed me a slip of paper with all the information about the security systems. It instructed me to download an app and log in to set everything up. That evening, after I had moved most of my things into the house, I lounged on my bed with my phone. I pulled up the security app and tapped through it. The interface was fairly clunky and difficult to use. It looked quite outdated compared to the newer, higher-end systems that people purchase. However, it did let me access both cameras, the one at my front door and the one at my back. I spent a few minutes looking around at my driveway before getting bored and just opening up a game. As the hours dragged on, I eventually found myself getting more and more tired before falling asleep with my phone in my hand. When I woke up in the morning, I was confused. For the first few seconds, I wasn't sure where I was, but after taking a moment, I realized where I was and sighed with relief. I grabbed my phone to check the time and was surprised to find a notification on my home screen. It was a notification from my security system that I had previously set up. It told me that someone had rung my doorbell a short time after I fell asleep. I thought this was odd, as I had fallen asleep late in the evening. I pulled up the app and I scrolled back to that time. It gave me a precise time for the ring, but the camera showed no one standing outside of my door. I scrolled back and forth for some minutes before eventually giving up and beginning my day. Nearly a week after I had moved in, I was lounging in the living room on the cheap couch that my parents had gifted me, watching a bit of TV, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I got my phone out to check to see who was texting me, but it was another security alert. This time, it said, "Motion detected." I opened the app and activated the camera. As the tiny feed came into view, I couldn't see anything. Then, I noticed something at the corner. Someone was standing in my driveway, but they weren't moving, just standing there near my car. I sighed and rose from my seat. I walked over to the door and opened it. I called out loud and with a stern voice, "Hello," but was quickly silenced as I didn't see anyone standing out there. My entire driveway was clear except for my car. I even stepped out and walked around my vehicle to make sure no one was hiding behind it. I then took a moment to look up and down the sidewalk, but I couldn't see anyone around. Scratching my head, I went back inside. There wasn't another incident like that for the following 2 weeks. Then, towards the end of the first month of living there, something even stranger happened. I was in my room typing up some reports I missed at work, so that I wouldn't have to get chewed out from my boss the following day, when my phone suddenly began vibrating along my desk. It was almost like I was receiving multiple text messages. I quickly grabbed my phone and flipped it over. There were numerous alerts from my security system going off every few seconds. There were motion alerts from both my front door and my back door. At first, I figured the devices were messing up. That seemed to calm my mind, if only slightly. Still, I opened up the application to make sure it was just nothing. When I switched on the front door camera, I felt my heart drop. There was another shadow figure. This time, it was standing on the path leading towards my door. This might sound crazy, but it looked almost like a mummy wrapped all in black, and it was slowly moving towards the front door before stopping just shy of it. It then stepped into the light of my porch and brought its face inches away from the camera. It was shrouded, but the face that illuminated was deeply contorted. It grinned into the camera that sent chills through my body, and I felt as if it was looking directly into my eyes. It then took a few steps backward into the shadows and just stood there on the edge of the frame. I could feel my skin crawling as my heart was pumping out of my chest. That's when my phone vibrated in my hand, and I nearly dropped it as a result. Motion detected at back door. I fumbled through the app to swap the camera to the one facing my backyard. The way the camera at my back door is set up, it's mounted on the wall so I could see the entire back patio and door, with a portion of the backyard itself. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, I noticed something that made my stomach drop and my body seize. My back door was open. I always set the alarm to go off right before I go to sleep, but since I was wide awake, I still hadn't done it. I quickly stood up and rushed over to my bedroom door, locking it in the process. As I was facing my door, for the briefest of seconds, I could have sworn I heard breathing coming from the other side. A ragged, labor breathing, as if someone was pressing their face against the wood. The sound of a nail being scraped on the wood began to resonate throughout my room. Then, after a few minutes, the sound stopped. I just sat there against the wall, opposite of my door, trying to desperately rationalize the situation I was in. Before I knew it, hours had passed, and the sun was already cresting through my window, and I rose from my seat. Slowly, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The coast was clear. I have no idea where that thing came from, or what it even wanted with me. All I know is that it's gonna take some time for me to find a new place to live. In the meantime, I'm heading down to the store to buy a hammer, wood, and a lot of nails. At this point, I'm buying a gun as well. We all have our fears, whether it's spiders, the darkness, or anything else. It's hard to find someone who isn't at least afraid of something. I am no exception. Ever since I was a kid, garages were the one fear that would never go away. 54 years on this earth, and I still can't go into a garage without turning the light on. Last night, my husband asked me to go get some milk from the garage fridge. I went, but I stopped when I heard him speak again. Hey, the garage light isn't working, so you're gonna have to use the flashlight on your phone. It's not even a big deal, I thought to myself. You're gonna have to grow up and use a flashlight. It was a habit to turn on the light and check every inch of the room upon entering the garage. I don't know what I check for, but there is always just an overwhelming feeling to do this. My siblings used to make fun of me for it, which was kind of well deserved, until one time, they took it too far. It was April 1st, and feeling very groggy and half asleep, I opened my bedroom door, and a bag was placed over my head. I heard the giggling of my sisters as they pushed me into the garage and locked the door behind me. Looking back on it, they might have been trying to help me get over my fear, but it didn't fucking work. Engulfed in darkness, and also unable to find the light switch, I did the only thing that seemed rational. I screamed. For what felt like hours, but it was just a minute or two. I screamed as loud as I possibly could. When my parents finally opened the door, they found me sobbing, curled up in a ball and still screaming. It took them about 15 minutes just to calm me down. I was finally able to explain what happened, but I did leave out a detail. Maybe it was just my imagination, since I was being very loud and easily could have misheard. But when I was in there, I thought that maybe just for a second, I could hear something screaming back at me. That was the only incident involving garages that I had for my entire childhood, and even up to now being an adult. That is, until earlier today. Like I said, the garage light was broken, so I had to enter it armed with just my phone. I wish I would have told my husband to do it, but maybe that wouldn't have changed anything. So I entered the room, and I walked towards the fridge. I was looking everywhere with the light of my phone. There was nothing. There are many items and objects that can take the shape or silhouette of something. I opened the door to the fridge, and that's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, and that's when I was met with the face of my husband. "I got you, didn't I?" he said, very excited. Not amused, I sighed and grabbed the milk, then followed him out. He went upstairs, and I glanced over to the kitchen, where I saw my husband standing. So my fear wasn't so irrational all this time. It's been 9 hours now, and I can still hear footsteps above my head. I don't know what that thing is, but I guess all I can do is wait for it to come back downstairs. A couple of years ago, I went to a rehab in South California for alcohol and drug addictions. My family and friends were beginning to worry about me a lot, so if anything, I did it more for them than for me. I was there for almost 4 months. We all got pretty close. However, tragedy struck and my roommate decided to hit the needle again. Needless to say, that was the last time he ever would, as he overdosed in his apartment, collapsed in his closet with a needle still in his arm. This is where some friends and I found him, motionless. We called 911 immediately, but it was too late. A few weeks passed, and we are still living in the same apartment that he passed away in. Being sober, and not really knowing what sober people do with their time and lives all day, we did a bunch of random shit to keep our minds off our old habits. On this one specific night, we decided to use a Ouija board. We all sat in the living room and began. We said the prayer, put our hands on the planchette, and started asking routine questions and got nothing. We were about to quit when someone had the brilliant idea of going into our friend's room that passed away. Sitting in the room, we pulled everything out, redid the procedure, and asked for, let's call him Brad. We then asked, Brad, are you still with us? Surprisingly, the planchette went to yes. Both a little freaked out and a little excited, we continued. We then asked simple things like if he was okay, etc. Everything was fine until we asked Brad why he did it. The planchette then went to BADGNE. We thought about this for a while and asked, is Brad gone? The planchette then started moving like I never seen it move before. Z-O-Z-O-Z-O. Over and over again. I had no clue what the fuck this was, but I turned to my friend, and his face was white. When the planchette finally came to a rest, I asked my friend what was wrong. We need to quit. We need to stop this right now. Being a huge tough guy, it was strange to see him so scared. Stop being a pussy, I jokingly said. That's Zozo, a Ouija board demon. He acts to be a friend or family member and then finally reveals himself. I took this in and kind of chuckled to myself. That friend took off and went back to his apartment while the two of us stayed, laughing at the demon and cussing him out. We finally asked what he wanted, and the planchette pointed right at me. Terrified, I asked, what do you want with me? It then started moving to the letters H-E-L-L. You want me in hell? It then moved towards yes. Are you going to kill me? The planchette stayed at yes. Getting a little freaked out, I asked, how are you gonna kill me? It then started moving towards F-I-R-E. And then out of nowhere, the planchette shot towards one of our candles, knocking it onto the floor, starting a small fire on the carpet. We quickly put it out, and as we were doing so, we looked back at the Ouija board, terrified. We picked up the planchette and walked back to the board and said goodbye. And then we went outside to burn that board that same night. I refused to sleep in that apartment after that night, and I ended up relapsing after going back home. So I beg you, don't ever play with a Ouija board. And Zozo, I hope we never meet again. About a year ago, I moved my family and I to a home way out in the woods in Tennessee. I wanted to be brief here, but I need to get this off my chest. And after looking into this a little bit more, I have a lot more details that I think will paint a clearer picture in the end, so just bear with me. The nights here can be very loud. Between the crickets, the tree frogs, and everything else in between, it can be deafening. One night, not too long after we moved in, I had forgotten something in my car and headed outside to go get it. The first thing that struck me as odd was that my dog wouldn't go outside with me. My dog goes everywhere with me. But not this night. As I held the door open, she looked out then looked up at me like no. So I walked out and shut the door behind me. The second thing that caught me off guard was that there was not a peep. It was dead silent. I still shrugged this off and walked down my front steps and headed down to my car. When I had gotten about 10 feet from my car, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt as though something was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. After I reached into my vehicle for what I had forgotten to grab earlier, I had this feeling like something was moving towards me. I took a step back, and I checked around me. All of a sudden, I heard one of my hedges next to me that lined the walkway to our front door rattle. At first, I thought it was a rabbit that I had scared, as I had seen one just earlier in the day right where this was. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a large rock, landing a few feet away from me. It hit the walkway and bounced into a shrub. I drew my gun and called out and said whoever this was is about to get shot. After a few seconds of nothing, I began to think that maybe this was some local teenager messing with the new people. I holstered my gun and turned and started walking back to the front door. Almost as soon as I turned towards my house, I heard this deep sound. It sounded like a huge dog, but what made me know back to my front door was that it sounded like it was right behind me. I leaped up into my porch, turned and drew my firearm again, expecting something right there. But again, there was nothing. A couple weeks later, I was on my porch at night, sitting on a bench with my wife. She got up and walked inside to get something, and as soon as she shut the door, I heard that same sound again. I couldn't see anything, yet this sounded like it was right on top of me. The sound was coming from everywhere, and it was very loud. Again, I couldn't see anything, so I noped it back inside of my house. Now at this point I was questioning moving here, but after nothing else really happening, I let it all go. A month or so later, it was a really rainy and stormy night. This is around 9 p.m., and my wife and I enjoy listening to the rain and talking about how relaxing the rain is. I grew up in Oregon, so I love the rain. And for the past 10 years, we lived somewhere else where it would dump the entire year of rain in one single day, then be bone dry for the rest of the year. Now for my wife, the rain was such a rare thing. She loved going outside and watching the rain. So for us, this is an enjoyable experience. As we were sitting there talking about the rain and relaxing, my wife stops and says, "Did you hear that?" And I said, no. What did you hear?" I swear it sounded like a small child calling for help out in the woods beside our house. She said, "No, I didn't hear anything." After a few moments of us listening, she was like, "There it is. I didn't hear anything, sweetie. Are you sure you're not just hearing things?" She looked at me offended that I didn't hear anything and said, "No, I'm positive. How could you not hear that? It was our son. I think he's out there and got lost." We then both looked through the blinds that were open right behind us, and we could see all of our children laying there. She said it was so weird that it sounded like our son. Well, it's not him. He's right there. Besides, I don't hear anything. She then stands up and says, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to go look for him." Now at this point, if you knew my wife, you would know that she is absolutely creeped out by the woods and wouldn't be caught dead walking into them during daylight, much less at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I've been listening, and there's nobody calling out for help." At this point, I'm getting a little bit worried. She was acting completely out of character, not to mention that at this time she is 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter. She then says, "What if there's some child out there lost?" Well, first of all, I would be able to hear them as well. Second, there are no other kids around here for miles, and the odds of them being lost 100 feet from our house is not possible. She then says, I know, but what if it's a kid? Before I could say anything else, she stands up and starts walking towards the stairs. I jumped up and grabbed her hand again and said, I don't know what's going on, but you need to go inside. I didn't know what this was, but it freaked me out. A few months after this, just as it was getting dark outside, I heard the front door to our house open and I got up to investigate. We have autistic 6-year-old twins, and we have the door set up so that they can't open it without us there. So to hear the sound, it could only be my wife. What was more weird is the fact that she doesn't go outside without saying something to me. I walked out front and saw my wife walking down our private road towards the drive on the side of our house. I asked her what she's doing, and she said that she was sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying out in the woods. Are you serious? And you just decided to walk off into the woods to investigate? I said. She then looks out into the woods and says, See, there it is again. I couldn't hear anything, but what I did notice is that it was completely quiet outside again. I told her just like before, the chances of a baby being out in the woods outside our house is slim, and that she needed to get back in the house. She then said, what if someone left a baby out there? Well, if that was true, I would hear it as well. Now at this point I was really starting to worry about my wife's mental health. I asked her to see a psychiatrist, and she did. Looking back now, I feel really bad about this, knowing what I know now. A key to this moment was that my wife had just given birth to a baby girl a month before. A few days after this, we're out on the front porch again. It's early evening, and I had just cut the grass this day, and our 3-year-old son was riding around on his little car in front of the house. Now he knows that he's not allowed outside of a certain area that we mapped off. He loves playing outside, but with the road behind 50 feet from our front porch, we have to be careful as a lot of trucks will fly through after drinking all day on their boats. As we're talking, we're both keeping an eye on him. A neighbor then drives by and stops to say hi for a second. This interaction took about 8 seconds, as all they said was how are things, and we said we're good, and he told us he would stop by later as his wife got something for the kids, who happens to be one of their teachers in school. We simply say okay, and he drives off. I looked over where our son was at, and he was gone. I called out his name and ran over to the side of the house, and I could hear his car on our side drive. I scolded him for leaving the area, and he said something in his 3-year-old gibberish and pointed to the woods behind our house. I then told him that he had 5 seconds to get back up to the front of the house or else. He then pointed back in the direction of the woods and kept trying to tell me something. I looked off to where he was pointing at and just assumed that he saw a deer or a squirrel or something and he wanted to see it up close. I walked him back up to the front of the house and he cried the whole way there. He got really upset that I wouldn't let him go into the woods, but I just wrote this off as him being curious, as most 3-year-old boys are. Now this situation isn't isolated, as our twins have done similar things, but nothing very extreme like this. There have been nights where we just laid down for the night, and we heard a loud bang on the side of our house on the wall behind our bed. It was so loud that I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight had come on, but I couldn't see anything. Now the weird part about this is that our bedroom sits about 12 feet from the ground level, as we have a full-size basement that's cinder block. I put on my slippers and grabbed my shotgun and walked outside to investigate. It was dead silent again. The floodlight that's on the side of the house had clicked off at this point. So I walked over to the end of the deck and shined my light around the yard. There was nothing. I walked around the house and shined the light around intently. As I approached the back side of my house, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Again, it felt like someone was watching me. I shined the light up in the trees, but again, nothing. I rounded the corner and the first thing I noticed was that my 3 dogs that were in their area weren't making a single sound. Now our dogs have no filter and will bark at anyone and everyone. This includes me as well. So to see them all hiding with their tails between their legs, not making a single sound, really had me worried. As I kept walking, all of a sudden, the crickets and frogs started making sounds again. It was like someone had clicked a switch. I walked back into the house and told my wife that I hadn't seen anything. She shrugged and said okay as long as our dogs were okay. Due to the circumstances that night, I decided to let the dogs in and sleep with us. This very same thing has happened on all 4 exterior walls of our house. It's random and annoying, but just like this instance, every time there's nothing going on outside. There have also been times when we're sitting in the house, and as I was watching a movie, my wife walked over to me and said, "Did you call me?" I say no, and she says that she heard me call her name in her ear. She said it was definitely my voice, but she didn't understand because it sounded so close, and I was a good 20 feet away from her in my recliner. The important part to this was that she was sitting at the table doing something, and the slider to the backyard was open behind her. Now, our back patio sits about 20 feet off the ground, and it's like a balcony as it has no stair access outside. There have been several instances where she would say that she heard someone whisper in her ear, but she couldn't make out the sound. Again, I kept thinking that she was going crazy, but as you will see, I think all of this is tied into this final moment where things are revealed. The last thing I want to mention before we get into what just happened is that I have a shooting range built behind my workshop on the opposite side of our property next to the main road. It's kind of on a downslope, but it works perfectly for what I need it for. The range itself is cut straight into the woods going down about 100 yards or so. When you're at the downrange, you have wood surrounding you on all sides except back up to my shop. I have to say, it has always felt creepy when I'm dealing with my targets or mowing the grass. When you're down there, it feels like you're miles from anyone. One day, around 5 in the evening, I was sighting in a new rifle scope. The sun was still up, but it was going to start to fade soon, so I knew this was going to be the final test. Up until this point, nothing really happened while I was making my trips downrange, other than the feeling of uneasiness. As I got downrange, I kept getting this feeling like someone, or something, was watching me. I looked around but didn't see anything. As I was placing stickers over my previous shots, I heard something big off to the side of me. It sounded like a large branch had snapped off of a tree. Now, if you've been in the Tennessee woods, you will know that a lot of branches fall off the trees randomly out of nowhere. Except this time, it was very loud and sounded like fresh, strong wood, if that makes any sense. I turned and looked, but again I couldn't see anything. I started walking back up to my rifle, and I swear, I heard someone right behind me. I turned around, but again, saw nothing. As I started to walk again, that's when I heard it, a deep growling noise. It was really deep and loud, and what's worse is that it was all around me. I turned around facing the range and started walking backwards. The thought of some rabid dog charging out of the bushes had me freaked out, so running wasn't a good idea. I slowly walked backwards up the hill to my rifle, but nothing happened. I grabbed my rifle and sprayed the target with rapid fire, hoping to scare off whatever was stalking me. I left 10 rounds in the mag, then grabbed my rifle bag, and I quickly walked back up to the house. I never told my wife about this, as I didn't want to freak her out. So about a year later from when we moved in, my niece started staying with us as a live-in nanny to earn money over summer break from college. We were on our way back from the store, and about a mile from our house, I saw 2 eyes reflecting in the headlights coming from a white tree on the side of the road just ahead. It caught my attention because they were higher than a deer, but a different color and size. Just as I had said, "What is that?" and squinted, they had vanished. I had made a comment that it was almost as if they had known I could see its eyes and moved. The color was kind of golden green, but they resembled the mannerism of a large cat, as they felt ominous. It's hard to explain, but I shrugged it off as we were passing the tree and saw nothing. A few moments later, we arrived at the house. As we were getting bags out of the car, My 3-year-old son came running out of the house excited to see me. As I was waiting to help her carry in her bags, I heard my dog growl. I looked in the direction she was looking at, which was towards my neighbor's property across the street. What I saw has kept me up all night. Up until this point, I have always been skeptical, as I had never seen anything with my own 2 eyes. Even with what just happened to me the year prior, I still had my doubts that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. My street is kind of a spread out neighborhood. Each house sits on several acres, and at the end of our road is Kentucky Lake. My neighbor's house is adjacent to my house on about an acre or 2 lot. Directly in front of my house is a wall of woods, and directly behind my house is several thousand acres of untouched forest. As I was looking across the street to my neighbor's property, I saw a large dark figure between the trees at first. The movement caught me off guard, as it looked like something big moving quickly on all 4s. Then, when it came out into clear view, it stood up and walked like a man. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. It was very tall, but the strange thing about it was that the distance it was covering, I swear, I could see through it. It was clearly walking quickly, but moving faster than any person could even sprint. There was also no sound. It was like it was phasing in and out of reality as it moved. I then said, "What the hell is that?" and realized that it was looking directly at us. It had moved at an angle away from us to minimize the time out in the open, and moving quickly as it could while still being silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whatever it was stalking us. I told my niece to get in the house right now, and I grabbed my son and booked it inside. I grabbed my rifle with a short scope and came back outside to see my niece still grabbing stuff out of her car. I watched over her without saying a word. As she was slowly walking, she turned towards the woods across the street from my house, and suddenly bolted for the house. She ran up the steps in a panicked state. I asked her what she saw, and her face was pale as a ghost. She then said, "I heard something big in the woods walking loud on the leaves, and when I turned towards it, I heard a deep guttural growl." I asked her why she didn't come when I told her, and she said she thought I was talking to my son. I told her what I had seen, and she wanted to get a closer look to see if she could see something. As she was walking on the walkway, I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching in the woods across the street. She's about 6 feet away from my wife's SUV. As she turned and started walking back to me, I caught a glimpse of something gray and hairy move from behind the SUV back across the street into the woods. My porch is kinda elevated, and our SUV is about 6 feet tall, and whatever this was, it cleared about 45 feet in what looked to be a single jump. It moved like lightning. Whatever it was, it wanted my niece. It jumped behind the car out of my line of sight and was waiting for her. She still doubted my warnings and grabbed a flashlight and walked back towards the car. As she entered my driveway, she stopped dead in her tracks, leaned a little bit, as if she could see something. I asked her what she saw. That's when she turned and ran back up the porch with a terrified look on her face. She said it was a figure, a shadow, hiding inside of a tree, and that she saw its eyes. I asked her what they looked like, and all she could say was that they looked red at first, but as she got closer, they looked dead. I said, "What do you mean by dead?" And she said that where the pupils were, it looked gray, like the way eyes look when they go blind, and she swears that she could see through it, almost like a dark cloud. She wanted to go out again and took a step down the stairs, and as she did, that's when it revealed itself from the tree. I then said to get inside, and I went in and locked the door. It looked like a very tall human-shaped being. It was really tall, and it looked ominous as hell. The next morning, we did a height comparison to the tree limb where she saw it stand over, and we put it to around 9 feet tall, and its eyes were about 6 inches apart. At this point, I don't know what this thing was. After doing some research, I think this thing was a glimmerman, a crawler. I looked to see if there had been any other sightings in Benson County, but nothing. More important, I swear it would phase in and out. almost like a shadow person but bigger and more obvious. One of the weirdest things that I had came up with is that this thing can communicate without saying anything. This might explain why everyone was hearing something that nobody else could hear. Second, it has a playback-like communication. So when I heard a dog panting, it was most likely one of my dogs it heard. My wife was actually hearing our son crying for help, as he had recently fell and cried for help as well. The baby crying would be our newborn baby, who she had given birth to recently. And it must have heard me call my wife's name. And so maybe that's how it was calling my wife's name with my voice. Another thing that my niece had said that night was that she felt compelled to go back outside to it. She said she felt like this thing was communicating with her somehow, and it wanted her to go back outside. The more I read about this, the more everything that's been happening over the past year makes sense. One thing that I find extra convincing is that down the road, towards the lake, there's a property that is barbed wired off, and it's nothing but forest with no driveway. A lot of the property down our road is undeveloped land, and on one of the trees, there is this large old sign that says, "Screamer lives here," with an arrow pointing back into the woods. I have to admit, when I first saw this sign, I laughed thinking maybe the owner screamed at trespassers who enter his property, and teenagers put up the sign to mess with him. But when I did a satellite search of our neighborhood, that entire section of road has no houses or trails or anything, and it's just pure forest. Now that you understand my story, I doubt this is the ending. The next question is, what can we do? I don't want my wife or kids to disappear one day. I feel perplexed and scared, as what can I do? If you have any advice, let me know. Update 1. Thank you all for the support. We're overwhelmed with the number of responses that we have had. Unfortunately, we can't afford to get a camera system or the trail cameras that many have recommended. I'm a disabled veteran and had just lost my business to the COVID lockdowns, and we're struggling a little bit. That being said, I did go out soon after posting at night to try and get some evidence to bring here for you. The camera on my phone is not great for nighttime, and it seems to make the images very grainy with the low light. As I was sitting there that night, I did catch some strange sounds on the camera, as well as when I passed an area with my flashlight, there appeared to be something. But when I came back to it, there was nothing. Again, due to the light, it's very hard to make out. I haven't felt comfortable going out since then. My niece just came back from a week's vacation in Florida, so we're planning to sit out there a couple of nights to see if we can get anything. This stuff has been happening for some time now, but it was random and far apart. Ever since this last incident, I have seen things that I can't even explain, but they seem to be happening almost on a daily basis now. Last night, when my niece arrived, we went out on the front porch to welcome her. I did notice something that looked like a face that was staring at me, but what is weird, as I was staring at it, it moved back into the shadow without moving, if that even makes any sense. These are the things I really want to get on here for you. There is a story of a man in Georgia who I believe saw the exact same thing I did that night, and if I find it, I'll post a link for you as well. We're also going to be working with an artist to try and get a good picture to show exactly what we saw that night. I really want to keep everyone updated on the things going on. There have been many other things that have happened here that I would also like to add. I know that they may not be connected, but I feel like you all should be the judge of that. The one thing that I do want to add in this update that I didn't think was connected was about 2-3 weeks ago. My wife and I had an argument about something silly. She decided to walk back into our woods to clear her mind. I was on the back patio when I noticed her walking down our shooting range. I asked her where she was going, and she said, to cool off. I know the chances of something happening to her was slim, but I did find it strange. that she would choose to go into the woods rather than simply walking down the road. I quickly got dressed and went down to try and bring her back. I went to the end of the range and called out her name. After a few minutes of calling out, I heard nothing. Not a single sound, not a twig, or anything. Now the weird part is that it's impossible to move around these woods without making a sound, especially for her. I was worried that she was walking too far, but I had to get back into the house as our children were alone. It freaked me out because it was as if she had just vanished. I went back in the house and debated calling someone, but I figured I would give her a little more time. I went to the back patio and waited. After about an hour, I started to get really worried. I called out her name again and decided that I would call if she hadn't returned in about 30 minutes. After another 20 minutes went by, she came walking back out of the woods. Angry that she had worried me so much, yet also relieved, I asked her what she was thinking, and she said, "What are you talking about?" As she walked back up into the house, she came and looked at me like I was crazy. I said, "Did you not hear me calling out to you?" She said she only heard me once and that she replied. Now, this is where it gets crazy. She said, "I only been gone for about 10 to 15 minutes. Why are you freaking out?" When I told her that she had been gone for an hour and 20 minutes, she didn't believe me. She also said that when she went down there, she didn't go very far, but when she turned around, she started walking and got worried that she was lost. She said she didn't recognize where she was, but something told her to keep walking. She said it felt strange and that the air felt different. When she came back out of the woods, she was relieved to see the house. Now the part that upsets me the most about this was that where she said she was is impossible. I was literally just standing 20 feet away from that spot. If she really was there, not only would I have seen her, but she could have talked to me in a normal voice. More concerning is that you can see the house from this spot, and how she felt lost. It's just crazy. I don't know what this was. I thought that again that she was just losing her mind. After reading some responses, I feel like what happened to her was real. I do plan to go back to that spot with her to prove that you can see the house from there, but I want her to show me exactly where all she went. I know some people are thinking that we're crazy, but I promise that I'm going to do whatever it takes to get proof and keep you updated as we figure this stuff out. I know it's turning into a book to read, but I want to be detailed as possible. Let me know if you want me to keep posting the updates here like this. I'm going to try to keep a weekly update for you all. Update 2, June 24, 2022. Weird things keep happening. Today, my 3-year-old son is playing on the back patio a few feet away from us, and all of a sudden, the dogs inside jump and start barking as one of our dogs that's on the patio with him comes bolting into the door. I jump up to see what's going on, and my son is pointing at the tree line saying, "Werewolf, Daddy, werewolf." Now my son loves watching videos of werewolves for children for some reason. I would normally put this off as nothing, but if you saw the look in his face, you would know that he was serious. Plus, with the way my dogs reacted, he had to have seen something. I pulled out my phone and began recording. He kept saying, "Daddy, look, werewolf in the bushes." I tell him I can't see anything, but I can hear something really big in the leaves. I'm gonna post a recording of this whole thing to see if any of you all can see anything that I might have missed. Update 3, July 9th, 2022. Alright, I meant to keep everyone updated up until now. I have just had a lot on my plate. My niece has quit. She says she can't handle all the stuff that's been happening to her. Everything was fine for a while. We kept indoors for the most part. We went out on the porch one night with a flashlight and camera hoping to catch something. We kept hearing things in the brush. After a while of not seeing anything, we went back inside. I said my prayers, then slept like a baby. My niece, however, did not. She woke up late the next day and seemed a bit jumpy. I then asked her, "What's wrong?" She said that she didn't sleep well as something was outside her window. It took some time to get her to talk about it. She said she could hear something big outside her window, but every time she looked, she couldn't see anything. She said she heard weird noises that she couldn't describe. She came out in the living room to see if I was still up, but I was fast asleep. She then decided to go back to her room and go to sleep watching YouTube on her phone. She said that she was almost asleep when she felt something standing right behind her. She turned around and said there was nothing. She said she kept having the feeling but brushed it off as her imagination. That was until about 3 a.m. when she woke up. She had the same feeling as before, but this time it was very intense. Like whatever it was, it wanted to devour her. She turned around quickly and saw what looked like a shadow disappear into the wall in the blink of an eye. She told me this kept happening until she passed out late in the morning. I told her it was weird as we have never experienced anything like that in the house before. We have had weird things happen, like things disappear for a while. Then they reappeared days or months later in the exact same spot they last were. She said it felt like whatever this was, it made her feel like it wanted to cause pain. I told her to keep me updated and to let me know if anything else happens. A few days later, she then asked if she can use the hot tub that's out back. I explained that it's off as we can't afford to heat it up. When we get over to it, I open it to look inside. To my disbelief, not only is it on, but the water looks great, minus a little cleanup that needed to be done. As I'm walking around, all of a sudden, I hear this really loud sound behind me, almost like a log falling onto the ground, or a really big boulder hitting the ground. Imagine an engine block falling 20 feet onto soft soil. It made me jump. I turned around but couldn't see anything as the brush was too thick. I kept helping her work on the spa. Then she says that she's gonna go inside and get changed so she can get in. I look around and realize that it's getting dark outside and I really don't want to be out here. I bend over to work on getting the filter cleaned out, and I hear what sounds like something big snapping branches and charging at me. It made me jump and run to the back door. I turned around to see what it was, and it was nothing. I walk back into the house and walk upstairs. I tell her that I heard something out there, and she looked at me for a minute, then said, "Well, I want to get in and relax." She then asked if I can leave the back patio door open so if she needs me, she can call. But according to her, she enjoyed the spa without incident. However, every day I noticed her getting more anxious and less willing to talk about it. She says every night something new happens to her, but when I ask her to explain, she always refuses. A few nights later, I walk out on the porch and notice it's dead quiet again. I ask her to come out on the porch with me, but she says that she's tired and wants to call her boyfriend and go to bed. My wife gets up early and takes care of the kids, and it's my job to handle night shift, so she's in bed at this point. I decide that I don't have the guts to do this alone, so I put on a movie and relax in my recliner. I end up falling asleep, then wake up at around 3 a.m. to a noise coming from my niece's room. It sounds like a very deep voice. I knock on the door. I call out several times, but get nothing in response. I figured it must be her video and decided to let it be. I head to bed, and just as I start to pass out, another loud bang happens. I wake up and hear what sounds like something skittering on the wall outside of my bedroom. I understand that this is way up in the air and physically impossible. I look out the window, but I don't see anything. After going out and checking on this noise a few times over the last year and finding nothing, I decided to forget it and just go back to sleep. The next day, my niece comes out and tells me that she had the shadow thing happen again. Except this time, she left her light on. She said she woke up to getting that feeling again. She said that when she opened her eyes, she could see an extremely tall shadow figure standing over the top of her. She said it was moving closer, and just as she started to see the details of its face,
She turned around in a panic, but nothing was there. She said the eyes haunted her but didn't want to elaborate any further. The next morning, for the first time ever, my niece is up bright and early. I noticed that she looked anxious as she told me that she is headed home for the 4th of July weekend and will be back on Tuesday. I ask her if she is okay, and she just says yes and quickly walks out the door. Later that day, I get a call from my sister telling me that she won't be coming back. I ask her if everything is alright, and she says that she just wants to enjoy the rest of her summer. A little while later, I get a call from my niece telling me that she doesn't want to work here anymore, and she can't handle the emotions of whatever is out there. She doesn't explain more than that. I checked on her room, and I noticed that she's been sleeping with one of the windows wide open. This window is perfectly accessible from the outside. I don't know what's been going on with her, but whatever it is, it looks like it could have been coming in the room. Anyways, jumping to the 4th of July, I do fireworks in front of our property by the road facing the woods. Due to what's been happening at night, I decide to do all this prior to it getting dark outside. We do our fireworks, and just as it starts to get dark, I get everyone inside. After a couple of hours, I remember that my hose is still on the ground and laying out by the road. I head out to clean everything up, and I put the hose away. While I'm doing this, that's when I notice that it's dead silent again, minus the sound of fireworks in the distance. The hairs on the back of my neck go up, and I get the feeling that I'm being watched again. I hurry and fix the hose and ran back to the house. I swear, I'm starting to wonder if it's just my mind playing tricks on me at this point. Update 4, January 2024. We're still here, and most of it has stopped. I have learned after an exhausting amount of research that yes, these things are very real, but they're not what most of us think they are. They're not our friends, and will never be. They have a hatred towards us, and are amazing at long cons and will trick you. You can absolutely draw them to you, but they can seek you out as well. I could really go into detail, but it's probably best that I don't do it. You have to rewire your thinking completely in order to understand what's actually happening. I am going to give advice to anyone if this stuff is happening to them and they want it to stop. If you saw something, you didn't. Don't look into the woods here at dusk or at night, because if you're looking for them, you will find them. I will definitely start by praying. Pray over your family, your land, and also try it when things start to get scary to see if it stops. Sometimes it can be simple as that. Many times, despite whatever it is, it seems to work. It might stick around in the woods, but hopefully you can keep it off your property. Kids can see things that we can't. For some reason, we lose this ability as we get older. I would sit the whole family down and have a serious conversation about what's going on, just to be straight up about the woods being dangerous and whatnot, and make sure to tell everybody to not listen to anyone who's calling them into the woods, that it will never be you or anybody else. Tell your kids to let you know as soon as they see something, so you can protect them, then cast it out with prayer. My neighbors actually came to help me because things were getting so out of control for everyone. So this is why I don't post anymore or talk about these things again. Slowly, all of my neighbors have seen things. Apparently, there's rules to living in Tennessee that most locals know about but don't share. Rules like don't whistle at night if you hear your name being called from the woods. No, you didn't. You didn't hear anything. If you hear some crying or anything while the woods are still, you didn't. You never talk about it. Otherwise, your acknowledgement may bring it closer. This will be my last update.
Stay safe out there. My family has a hunting cabin in the National Forest of Pennsylvania. My grandpa, who worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, bought the land in the 70s whenever the agents used to go into the mills and post ads for huge plots of land that the steel workers would break up and all get their own plots for dirt cheap, then help each other build their own camps. Allegedly, there was a gravesite found on the property that my grandpa bought. The details aren't exactly known how this was discovered, but apparently some type of survey was done before the property was sold. An archaeologist from the University of Pittsburgh uncovered a very old Native American grave. They excavated the grave, but the pit, by that point now just a depression in the ground, was still there. This was on my grandpa's property about 200 yards from the cabin. Of course, I don't know if any of this is true, but the depression was, and as far as I know, it's still there. And that was the story that we were all told. Of course, when I was a kid, my cousins and I used to do very dumb and stupid things, like go back to the site in the middle of the night, and we would dare each other to lay down on it. I must have been around 10 when this happened, back in the early 90s. My dad swears he doesn't remember it, but my cousin remembers it, as we still keep in touch. So we were sitting around the campfire, roasting hot dogs and marshmallows and talking, that type of stuff. Obviously there was no alcohol on my part, as I was around 10, and my dad didn't drink. I remember my dad telling everybody to be quiet, and my older cousins and my dad were talking about seeing somebody in the woods. My dad then shines a flashlight into the woods. We don't see anybody. We go back to business, and when my cousin actually shouts, "There he is again!" By shielding the light from the fire, you can see a wispy, grayish human figure walking through the woods slowly. Like he's not trying to make any noise. He was walking from our left, as if he came from behind the cabin, and was crossing the wood line along our left, and then across the front of the yard just along the trees, about 50 yards or so from us, taking a wide turn to avoid us. Nobody said a word. My dad and one of my cousins both shined flashlights several times, but he would disappear. You could only see him in the dark, and after your eyes were adjusted. At some point he walked in the field of view, where the fire was between us and him, and that was it. We never saw him again. One of the creepiest things out of all this is that he was walking towards the gravesite. We had never seen this before, and we never saw it again. I spent about a week every summer at the camp, until I was about 20. Family drama, weirdness. After my grandpa died, it kind of ruined the camp for us, and I haven't been back since then. Needless to say, we didn't mess with that grave, or any grave, again. After reading a few discussions on here, I decided to add one of the creepier, still unexplained events that happened to me, and to a group of friends within the past 5 years. Thinking back on it, I still get this unnerved bad feeling that just sort of lingers. Anyways, here it goes. A group of friends and myself rented a place on the lake for just a fun-filled drunken weekend. We were all in our young to mid-20s, and it was supposed to be just a big party. For the most part, that's what it was. The Friday night and Saturday morning we pretty much went all out having a blast on the water and just doing fun, stupid stuff. Well, naturally, when Saturday afternoon rolled around, we were all so dead from going all out that we decided it would be a night of no drinking. Maybe a little weed smoking by some of us, and just kind of having a chill evening at night. That's what it was, relaxful. So 9 p.m. comes rolling around, and about 8 of us were inside the house, and 5 of us were outside. The house was a 2-story with a 2nd-story deck back porch, and it was surrounded by the woods, and then down through the woods you would hit the lake. I'll mention that we had already experienced some weird things from the locals when we arrived in town. Mostly just backcountry old-timers that I assume were irritated because we were a bunch of college-age kids looking to have a good time. But the town and the lake are big, so it's not like anyone knew where we were staying at. Anyways, 3 of my friends were on the upstairs back porch, and my other friend and I were downstairs outside just talking on this little old table near the woods. I mean, it was otherwise just a really nice night. My friend and I were just getting lost in the conversation, and all of a sudden, there was this weird feeling, like an unnerving experience that came from the woods behind us. It was so strong that we both kind of quieted down, and then, out of nowhere, there was this loud chanting coming from deep within the woods. I have no idea how far away it was because of the way the lake is set up. I'm pretty sure the voices were carried up through the forest. It was so strong we both kind of quieted down, and then, out of nowhere, there were these loud voices coming from the woods. It sounded like some kind of secret cult, just chanting away, and all of the voices were male. I mean, they were loud and perfectly in sync. I think we were frozen for all about 20 seconds before I couldn't contain myself and ran towards the house with my friend following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with that chanting, but it felt very evil, like something so uninviting. I was shaking by the time we got up to the second story and ran out on the balcony with the other 3 friends, one of them who was my brother. By the time we got up there, the chanting was gone, and I naturally asked, "Did you guys hear that?" They had also heard the voices, and now seconds later, it began again. So the 5 of us are out there peering into the forest, listening to this chanting that would sometimes sound far away and then sound very close. There were all male voices in the weirdest language, and I don't even know what it was. It sounded almost like a strange extreme church. Then following the chanting, a loud bang like someone hit a huge metal object sounded, and then the worst part came. A man, screaming, in extreme pain, crying and screaming. All of my hair was up at this point. It was the scariest thing ever. My brother and I were staring at each other. The screaming stopped, and then it was back to the chanting, which eventually died out. I was so freaked out by it that I wanted to call the police, because it sounded like whoever screamed was in a lot of pain. That mixed with the weird chanting just made me immediately think of some terrible sacrifice going on. One friend tried to say that it must have been some drunk guys just messing around singing and being weird, but there is no way that was coming from some drunk guys. They were perfectly in sync, and then the loud screaming of pain. I didn't call the cops, and I wish I would have, but to be honest, the forest is so big, and since the lake house was up looking down at the woods and lake, it could have been anywhere. It definitely wasn't close to us, but it was close enough to hear all of that perfectly. We went in and got some of the others, but by the time they came out, everything had stopped. Someone actually wanted to go explore and find where it had been coming from, but obviously, that was a stupid idea. After that, I was so ready to go home. I can't explain the relief of driving away from there the next morning. Even now I just get the worst feeling that whatever it was, it felt so wrong and evil. I'll never forget that moment. I can only imagine it was some sort of secret cult that possibly sacrifices humans. I lived alone in this house for the past year, and up until now, I haven't had any issues. I had first moved into the small town in the middle of the Midwest a year ago after my job had to relocate me. I'm a factory manager, and I oversee the daily operations of a newly built factory on the outskirts of town. The moving part sucked, but once I was finally moved in, I would take a moment to view my surroundings, and I was fascinated. I was never much of a nature guy. I spent most of my youth in the major city, but seeing all the towering trees that wrapped around the entire town, like a protection barrier that made me feel safe, the intimidating mountains that formed the backdrop of our town were also very impressive. They gave the horizon character. It was truly a sight to behold. After around 10 months of living here, My company was opening up a new plant, and they asked if I could go oversee operations once again. However, this time, I declined. I asked if I could stay as the permanent manager of this location. They did mention a slight pay difference, but I didn't mind. Over the past year, everything was perfect. I would wake up at around 6 a.m., do my daily morning ritual, stop by the local cafe, which gave the best coffee on the planet, and be at work by 8. My job at the factory was quite simple. I was basically a babysitter. I dealt with discrepancies, did paperwork, checked in with my supervisors, and finally headed home around 6 p.m. My job probably sounds very tedious and boring to a lot of you, but I still enjoyed it. Plus, even with a pay cut, I was still making a pretty decent salary. I'm sure most of you aren't here to listen to me talk about my job or this town. However, at the beginning of last month, I saw something out in my backyard. The way my house is set up, my backyard butts right up to the surrounding tree line that surrounds this town. I had just gotten home from my job and was lying in bed, watching TV until around 10 p.m. When I finally got ready to go to sleep, I turned off the TV and also my nightstand lamp. I had rolled over and was facing my bedroom window, which pointed directly out into my backyard. It had snowed a few days prior, so my entire backyard had a thin layer of untouched snow. I was staring out the window, letting my mind wander as I was beginning to drift off to a peaceful slumber, when I saw the flash of something near the tree line. Seeing whatever it was made my mind refocus itself as I started to scan the trees outside. Not even 5 minutes later, I saw them. 2 eyes were shining in the tree line, reflecting light from some unknown source. They would bob up and down for a moment before stopping and staring at my house. They would then turn to the right or left, disappear for a minute or two, then reappear at a different spot. At first, I thought it must have been a wolf, or maybe some other nocturnal creature looking for food. I put it out of my thoughts and fell asleep. For the entire week straight, those eyes had basically become a routine for me, as they started to appear every night in the same exact spot. I would lie awake and watch them intently. I thought that maybe perhaps the area in the trees was some sort of natural grazing spot, that whatever animal this was had become accustomed to eating here every night. I watched as the eyes walked left to right, disappeared, and reappeared until my tired eyes could no longer stay open. At the end of the first week, something happened. I had just finished turning off the TV and had rolled over to wait for the animal to arrive. A half hour passed, and I was just about to go to sleep when the eyes reappeared. The eyes shined brightly in between the dark trees. After a few moments, the eyes seemed to get closer to my house. They were faintly growing in the distance. Then, once it crossed into the threshold into my backyard, my motion sensor lights I had set up on the back of my house went off. My eyes shot wide open, and I felt my heart rate slowly start to increase as I saw what was standing in my backyard. It looked like a man. Well, almost a man, who was hunched over on all fours like a dog. Its skin was bluish gray, and stringy black hair clung to its scalp, like the legs of a spider. Its eyes were massive, taking up most of its face. The sudden bright light caused it to raise a hand to shield its eyes. Its fingers were disturbingly long, like bony sticks, hovering over its face. The thing fell back and scrambled into the dark trees. After watching this event unfold, there was no way I was going to go back to bed after that. I got up from my bed and looked around my backyard. A few moments later, the motion sensor lights diminished, I continued scanning the trees for any sign of this creature, but it was gone. I spent the rest of the night trying to find any information I could on what I had seen. I looked around at countless websites, putting the description of what I saw. Most of them spoke of a ghost and demons, but this didn't seem like a demon to me. It looked like a very real thing in my backyard. There's even other websites that mention various creatures that have some similar traits and features as what I saw in my backyard. The following week I watched every window every single night in case it came back. But every single night, I was met with nothing. I was starting to think that what I saw wasn't even real, that I had fallen asleep while watching the trees, and that my own mind had crafted this vivid nightmare. At the beginning of last week, however, I realized it wasn't a nightmare. It was very real. I was heading to bed a little bit later than I normally would, and as I lay there, I began watching through my window. I wasn't watching as intently as I was from the previous week. Then, after one long blink, it appeared, and this time, I felt my heart thumping in my chest so hard that I thought it was going to stop at any moment. I could feel the air beginning to steam my eyes, as I hadn't shut them for 2 minutes straight. The reason I was so unnerved was that the creature was lowering its head from directly above the outside of my window. The roof of my house was still a fair distance from the top of my window, so that meant that this creature was somehow clinging to the outside of my house like a spider on a web. It stared into my window at me. Our eyes were locking in place like if we had some staring contest. I was wondering why my motion sensor lights hadn't gone off at all, but that thought quickly left my mind as I saw the creature reach its hand towards the glass. It began raking its sharp, jagged fingernails along the glass over and over again. The sound that was produced from digging its fingers into the glass, it's embarrassing to admit, but I was scared at this point, too scared to think and too scared to move. It pulled its hand away from the window, and with a quick swing, it shattered the glass into pieces. When it did this, I fell back out of bed and onto the floor. I wanted to get up to run out of there, screaming my head off, but I couldn't seem to take my eyes off this creature. It slithered its way through the broken window and crawled along the inside of my wall. It then stopped once it reached the corner of my bedroom and just stared at me. Its mouth began to crack open as if it hadn't opened its mouth for some time. Broken, sharp rotted teeth filled its mouth as it seemed to smile at me. A slight feeling of disgust began to form within the overwhelming fear that gripped me. In one rapid movement, the creature lunged from the wall of my bedroom over to me. It grabbed at me with its long fingers while its mouth was snapping in my face. I could truly sense that this creature was trying to kill me, or possibly even eat me. The commotion caused the lamp on my nightstand to topple over. I managed to switch it on with one hand, while my other hand held the creature at bay. The sudden light seemed to blind the creature briefly, and in that moment, I brought the lamp crashing down onto its head as hard as I could. It slumped over onto its side, and I shoved it off of me. I quickly got up, left the room, and called the police. I explained that a wild animal or something had broken into my house. They arrived shortly after, and I led them through my house into my bedroom. But when I opened my bedroom door, the creature was gone. They examined my broken window and realized that I was actually telling the truth. Even though when they asked me to describe what kind of animal it was, I stopped myself from telling them that it was a monster. I told them that I was sleeping and that it was too dark for me to see what it was. They nodded and told me to call them if it ever comes back. That was the beginning of last week, and I have since repaired my window and make sure that my motion sensor lights are working. I'm not sure what that creature actually was. Maybe some of you out there have more experience with this and can let me know. But as for me, well, I think I'm gonna actually contact the higher ups in my company, and I'm gonna ask them if that new manager position is still available. If it is, then I'll be more than happy to leave this place.